The Iowa caucus is going to break up for a moment here. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I'll officially welcome you here. Chuck, thank you. Today, the Senate's holding the first hearing in a decade on the need for a path to citizenship for our nation's immigrant farm workers. I am happy to make this not only a full committee hearing, but to acknowledge the chairman of our immigration subcommittee, Alex Padilla, who is an integral part of this conversation and a part of this hearing. During today's hearing, the committee will hear from a wide variety of Americans who support legalizing immigrant farm workers, including farmers, farm worker advocates, and our Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack, did you know that this is the first time the Secretary of Agriculture has testified before the Judiciary Committee in more than 20 years? I don't know what that secretary said, but we're glad to have you here today, and thanks for your historic appearance. Now, I have a little video that precedes this, and I'd like to ask that it be shown. It really reflects the reality of the work our immigrant farm workers do to keep our food on the table.
My name is Areli Arteaga, and I am proud to be a part of a family whose labor feeds this nation. No matter rain, wind, hail, they're out there producing our food for us.
You are on the hot ground without shade for hours and moving down the rows with your hands and knees.
If you had watermelon on the 4th of July, you can thank Samuel, Mario, and Juan, who were hard at work in 105-degree weather.
Farm workers face tough conditions even in good times. But during the pandemic, they were deemed essential and kept working, even though many lack the basic safety net they'd need if they got sick.
People who literally keep the country fed.
We've had farmers that I know take their own lives, a lot of farmers with really high stress.
The truth is you leave with fear that you could make your children, your family sick.
If you think about it, about the virus as a wildfire, we are dry tinder.
Some workers are trying to cope with illness and economic hardship, even while fearing deportation.
Shay's workers from Mexico were stuck at the border. That one day cost him and his family their entire...
Understand the ramifications of what's going on at the border and the lack of labor that we have in this country.
If our work is essential, would my parents and others be protected from detention and deportation?
Again, when we think about those frontline defenders, remember that the farm workers are part of that group. In fact, you might see that they are the base of the safety net.
They're picking the food that's on your dinner table.
Wherever I go, I see the people eating the food that we have harvested and drinking the milk my father has helped produce.
My parents and I have not stopped working in the fields despite fearing deportation.
Agriculture in general just deserves immigration reform.
Long-term labor solutions that support the health of American agriculture and its workers.
The food supply depends on these workers.
During this pandemic, we've all been forced to face the reality that our food supply chain depends to a great extent on the labor of immigrants. At every step of the food production process, from the moment a crop is planted to the moment our grocery bags are handed to us, there's an immigrant worker who plays a critical role in feeding our families. Their work is essential, and it's never easy. Our nation's farms, factories, and food processing plants can also be dangerous. I know a bit about that, probably more than some senators. Back when I was working my way through college a few years ago, I worked for a meat packing company in my hometown of East St. Louis, Illinois, Hunter Packing Company, now owned by John Morrell. I was paid $3.65 an hour, which was a pretty good rate. I stood elbow to elbow with the other workers on the assembly line as thousands of pounds of meat came marching nonstop down the conveyor belt. As summer help for 4 years, I came to work the worst jobs in the packing house. Under our union contract, an 8-hour workday meant processing 1,760 hogs, 220 an hour. Speeding up the overhead chain line meant building up numbers in the case of regular breakdowns. The work was hot, exhausting, dirty, and dangerous. In my home state of Illinois, the jobs at these meat and poultry processing plants are still exhausting, dirty, and dangerous. The next time you put a pork loin on the grill or chicken tenders in your kids' hands, just remember, our foreign-born workforce had a lot to do with the fact that you have that opportunity. And in the decades since I left the assembly line, food processing continues to be difficult and dangerous, especially because of COVID-19. Over the past year, the workers who kept our grocery store shelves stocked have endured immense hardship. The pandemic has torn through our nation's factories as well as our farms, because in these workplaces, social distancing is not an option. Whether they're packing meat or picking berries, the workers who supply our food tend to work in confined and crowded spaces. Many have been unable to protect themselves from exposure to the coronavirus. According to the Environmental Working Group, farm workers in more than a dozen states do not have access to PPE or COVID testing. And it's not uncommon for these workers to be transported to fields in tightly packed trucks housed in closed quarters. All of these factors have led to a devastating outcome. More than 500,000 ag workers have contracted COVID-19. And during the first year of the pandemic, more than 7,000 farm workers died of COVID-19. Sadly, the coronavirus is just one of many workplace hazards these workers face. They handle dangerous machinery, they experience repetitive strain injuries, they're regularly exposed to pesticides, and now we see in our western states, they face sweltering heat. In fact, farm workers are 35 times more likely than the average worker to die from heat exposure. These workers understand the risks of working on a farm. Many of them face another risk, one that is a direct result of our broken immigration system, the threat of deportation. About half of our nation's 2.5 million farm workers are undocumented. These workers head out to the field every morning to pick the fruits and vegetables that feed our families. But despite this essential work, they are at risk of being separated from their families. One of these workers was on the video, Vincent Reyes. Vicente Reyes is a DACA recipient who is currently studying robotics engineering at Bakersfield College in California. Outside of class, he works on a farm in the Central Valley, and he's a member of the United Farm Workers. Vicente is also the son of farm workers. His parents are undocumented. Each morning before they head to the field, there's one brief moment. They're facing a 14-hour shift many times. The parents hug Vicente. It's the last day they'll be together. When the pandemic began, Vicente and his family were unable to shelter in place because they are designated essential critical infrastructure workers by the previous administration. Even though they make essential contributions to our country and our economy, Vicente's parents still live every day in fear of deportation. It is an embarrassment to this great nation that we allow this injustice to continue. We in the Senate can change it. We can pass legislation that will not only keep hardworking families like Vicente's together, but strengthen the durability and resiliency of our food chain. Earlier this year, the House passed the Farm Workforce Modernization Act on a bipartisan basis. This landmark legislation is the product of an historic agreement between farmers and farm workers. It would fundamentally change the lives of hundreds of thousands of farm workers who came to our rescue during the darkest days of the pandemic, and it would allow them to continue doing their essential work without fear of deportation. Many agriculture stakeholders, from dairy to specialty crops to livestock, have said they are facing serious worker shortages and that immigrant farm workers are critical. That's why across America, both farm workers and farmers are calling on the Senate to pass the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Farm workers not only deserve a path to legal status, they are vital to our nation's economic future. For evidence of that, I look no further than my own state. A few years ago, a legislator from my home state said, quote, "Illinois has been a mirror of America." There is no state, I might add, that better reflects the diversified nature of America's economy. We have one of the largest metropolitan areas around Chicago and 27 million acres of farmland. And over the past couple decades, a troubling trend has emerged in our state. While the population growth rate in our urban areas has increased, it has decreased in our rural areas. To put it simply, declining population growth means that in years to come, our rural communities are going to have fewer consumers to shop and fewer taxpayers to fund schools and hospitals. And these divergent trends in urban and rural population are not exclusive to my state. They pose a long-term risk to our nation's health. But the Senate can help turn the tide. We can enact reforms to immigration system that encourage families to move to the rural parts of our states, not only so they can work on the farms, but so they can open businesses, restaurants, and shops, and contribute to the economy as consumers and taxpayers. Our farms and the communities surrounding them are some of our nation's greatest assets. Let's enact policies that help them to survive and thrive. When we debate legislation like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, what we're really debating is the future of America, and particularly rural America. Let's invest in that future with hardworking, good people. With that, I'm going to hand off to Ranking Member Grassley for his opening statement.
I did not have the same work experience you had, Mr. Chairman, at a packing company, but I can tell you that I can attest to the conditions that you described where you worked, because I saw them every day for 6 years at the Rath Packing Company in Waterloo, Iowa. And that paid for my way through the University of Northern Iowa. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Very important. We hear about the lack of labor in agriculture, even in my state of Iowa. I thank Secretary Vilsack for being here. I'd be remiss if I didn't start today's hearing by noting that last month, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered 188,829 people at our southern border, a 471% increase from the year before. Encountered with unaccompanied children were up 802% from last June. Family units encountered were up 3,224% from last June. It's clear that we're still facing an ongoing crisis at the southern border, and it's long past time for this committee to exercise its oversight responsibilities and seek testimony from the Secretary of Homeland Security and other administration officials regarding what they're doing or not doing to address this issue. With respect to the issue of agriculture labor, it's an unfortunate reality that a significant portion of our agriculture workforce is made up of undocumented immigrants. It's also an unfortunate reality that the H-2A program, which was set up to secure agricultural labor into the United States, doesn't work well for many employers, including in my home state of Iowa. I'd like to make 3 points regarding congressional consideration of agriculture labor reform proposals. First, the primary focus of any such proposal should be reforming the H-2A program to ensure that farmers and agriculture employers have access to a stable and legal workforce. I consistently hear from employers in my home state about the need for Congress to improve their ability to get access to labor. This will, in part, involve expanding the program to cover year-round agricultural industries such as dairy, all animal agriculture, and agriculture processing that are currently excluded. I want to emphasize, excluded from the H-2A program. It should also involve streamlining the program, reducing red tape, and addressing a very high cost of using the program for many farmers and agricultural employers. We'll hear from some of our witnesses today about how the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, the focus of today's hearing, falls short in addressing a number of these issues. Second, it is important that any agriculture labor reform and immigration reform more broadly include a robust and mandatory E-Verify component. Finally, agricultural labor reform shouldn't include a mass amnesty of current undocumented immigrant farm workers. We should learn from the mistakes of the past, or we're doomed to repeat them. So let me repeat what I learned from the 1986 legislation that I voted for. It was termed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which provided an amnesty to more than 1 million farm workers under what was called the Special Agriculture Workers Program. At the time, the American people were told that the 1986 amnesty bill would be a one-time fix. Title I of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act creates a program called the Certified Agriculture Worker Status that is in many respects almost identical to the Special Agriculture Workers Program that Congress created in 1986. 1986 saw that Special Agriculture Worker Program had an amnesty part to it. It was notoriously riddled with fraud. So I'm going to make some quotes that this isn't just Chuck Grassley saying it. The New York Times called the Special Agriculture Program, quote, one of the most extensive immigration frauds ever perpetrated against the United States government, end of quote. Then Congressman, now Senator Chuck Schumer said at that time, he was one of the authors of that program in the 1986 bill, he said that it was, quote, too open. Well, just two words from his quote, but it's too open, and he implied susceptible to fraud. In July 2000 report, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice noted that in 1995, management at the then Immigration and Naturalization Service estimated that 70% of the special agriculture worker applications were fraudulent. On top of being bad policy, a mass amnesty of current farm workers also does absolutely nothing to address agriculture labor shortages and workforce issues. As we saw in the aftermath of the 1986 amnesty bill, many agriculture workers who received legal status ultimately left the agricultural sector. Employers then turned to a new pool of undocumented immigrant workers to replace all the ones who had left, and thus the cycle simply began once again. I hope that Congress will ultimately be able to address agricultural labor reform in a way that breaks the cycle of dependence upon labor that illegally crosses our border and would find legal ways to bring them into the country, and thus actually help farm and agricultural employers get access to the legal labor that they need, and even in the state of Iowa, I hear this. The bill we're discussing today doesn't do that, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on the legislation that does. Thank you.
Of the Immigration Subcommittee, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for inviting me to co-chair this hearing, as well as to your committee staff for all the work they put into organizing today. You know, I often say that no state has more at stake in immigration reform than my home state of California. And it's especially true when it comes to the essential role of farm workers. California is the agricultural heart of the nation. We know that more than a third of our country's vegetables and 2/3 of fruits and nuts come from California. In fact, farmers in California, not just in California, but especially in California, struggle every year to hire as many farm workers as they need to pick major crops. That's been the case since prior to the pandemic. That's why our agricultural industry has relied for decades on the labor of immigrants. And if we look back in our nation's history and recall that during both our major world wars, immigrants kept our country fed. We'll recall the Bracero program, for example, which brought millions of temporary workers to California at the time. We also reflect on the 1960s, when California's immigrant farm workers led a historic boycott to fight for safer working conditions. Today, an estimated 60, upwards of 75% of California's farm workers are undocumented. Now, these dedicated individuals work back-breaking jobs for hours on end to give their families a better chance in life and to feed all of our families across the nation. That's why I believe they deserve better wages, better working conditions, including overtime pay, but I digress. That may be a subject of a hearing on another day. But let's reflect on this last year and a half. during the COVID-19 pandemic, it wasn't just the United States government. Let's be clear about this. Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security deemed farm workers essential workers. Think about what that means. Formal recognition by the federal government that farm workers, regardless of immigration status, are critical to our nation, critical to the food supply, critical to our economy. We can't live without them. I think that was the case long before the pandemic, but it was formalized during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's no surprise that despite the challenges of COVID, farm workers continue to show up for work, despite the triple threats of the pandemic, extreme heat waves, and record-breaking wildfires. Now, because of their outsized presence on the front lines and the climate crisis, farm worker communities have suffered a disproportionate number of illnesses and deaths, but they still continue to show up for work. At the same time, many of these workers face increased risks because of their undocumented status, showing up for work despite living in fear of deportation. Too many were denied the necessary PPE to try to mitigate the risks they were exposed to. Others unable, because of ineligibility, to seek health care. Too many afraid to speak out against the dangerous working conditions for fear of retaliation, including but not limited to threats of deportation by their employer. More than 500,000 farm workers, more than 500,000 essential farm workers per the US government contracted the coronavirus, and thousands of them lost their lives. Farm workers and all workers who've worked on the front lines during the pandemic deserve better. They deserve our gratitude, they deserve security, and they deserve a pathway to citizenship. Let's recognize that farm workers, most of the adults having lived here on average 18 years, is a very different group of workers, residents, than those that may have showed up at the southern border in the last couple of months. Let's not conflate the two issues. Addressing the challenges at the border, reforming our amnesty system is important, but let's not let that stand in the way of justice for farm workers and other essential workers. That's why I support the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, and that's why I was inspired to introduce the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act as my first bill in the Senate. It is fundamentally wrong for the United States government to recognize workers and deem them essential, yet deny them legal protections and status at the same time. As the proud son of immigrants, I know that immigrants have always been essential since long before the pandemic. So passing immigration reform that respects the dignity and the worth of all immigrants is also a recognition of their contribution to our economy and our national security. So I look forward to today's hearing, to hearing from the witnesses, and to making it clear what Congress can do to act to ensure farm workers have these basic rights and protections. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman Padilla. The ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, Senator Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy of allowing me to make a brief introductory statement. I strongly agree with the underlying premise of this hearing. Immigrant and non-immigrant farm workers are essential to agriculture and feeding the United States population. That's why it's so important to take the time to study the deficiencies in the current guest worker programs and to consider needed reforms. Farmers and ranchers and producers face labor shortages at home. I hear it all the time from my constituents, and they've turned to guest workers to fill their needs. According to statistics published by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the number of H-2A guest worker positions requested by ag producers has grown from around 48,000 in 2005 to nearly 258,000 in 2019. But as Senator Grassley pointed out a moment ago, the H-2A program only fills some of the agriculture community's labor needs. Farmers can only rely on the program for temporary seasonal workers, which may work in some places, but certainly not in others. Dairies, mushroom producers, livestock producers, others with year-round needs are left out. Producers who have different needs at different times through the season have to submit separate petitions for each arrival date. And the existing H-2A program, again, as Senator Grassley pointed out, is cumbersome and expensive for producers. So I look forward to learning from our witnesses today about the changes we can make in the program to better tailor it to our 21st century agricultural labor needs. However, as we consider adjustments to the H-2A program, we need to be careful that we don't unintentionally create new problems for our ag producers and ultimately increase prices for American consumers, further driving up inflation. I'm concerned that the bill that forms the centerpiece of this hearing, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, does not yet have unified support from the agriculture community. In particular, I've heard from the Texas Farm Bureau and the American Farm Bureau who've expressed concerns and they are seeking some changes in the legislation as currently drafted. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that a copy of the letter they sent to you and to Senator Grassley be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. In its current state, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is not ripe for legislative action, and more work needs to be done to build a consensus, and I'm happy to be a part of that effort. When Congress created the Special Agriculture Worker Program in 1986, many of the workers who received lawful permanent resident status through the program ultimately did not remain in agriculture. The Congressional Research Service has attributed that departure from their newfound eligibility for non-farm jobs. And it makes sense. If people are here legally and they're not required to work in ag jobs, they have the option of working in less challenging working conditions. They're likely to move, as the Congressional Research Service has said. So if Congress was merely to legalize the existing undocumented immigrant farm worker population without addressing the underlying reasons they're unlawfully present in the country in the first place, and without making the necessary changes in the guest worker programs, I fear we would repeat the mistakes of the past, as Senator Grassley pointed out, and create even more problems for our ag producers and our food supply. Any plan to legalize portion of the undocumented farm worker population must be coupled with a plan to replace those workers. We should not move only the legalization element of the proposal independent of the guest worker provisions, and we still need to make some changes, as I've indicated, in the guest worker provisions. Chairman Durbin, as you know, we've been discussing the Farm Workforce Modernization Act as part of our bipartisan immigration talks. And as I said, I don't believe the bill is currently ripe for legislative action, but we should continue our work to make changes that will allow us to build the necessary consensus. And as we address the broader issue in this setting, we need to remain open to making incremental progress on issues like guest worker reform, permanent legal status for DACA recipients, and the crisis at our border. I've heard concerning reports that some of our Democratic colleagues are considering using a partisan budget reconciliation process to create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. It almost surely will not work consistent with the rules of the Senate. Members of the committee know full well that immigration law is not written through our arcane budget procedures, and I hope our Democratic colleagues will commit to moving through any immigration reforms through the normal legislative process so it could be truly bipartisan and a consensus effort. Finally, regarding the border crisis that disproportionately affects my state with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, I'm disappointed we don't have a witness here from the Department of Homeland Security who can speak directly to that issue. Last month, CBP encountered 188,000 migrants along the southwestern border. Just a few days ago, the Center for Disease Control told us that 93,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, mainly from illicit drugs coming across the southwestern border. And many of our Border Patrol are taken off the front lines of securing the border because they're taking care of unaccompanied children and others claiming asylum. These surges have peaked in May, but the numbers have only continued to climb. It cannot possibly help that the Biden administration is also publicly mulling over ending its authority to expel migrants under a public health Title 42 in the coming weeks. Indeed, the COVID positive test rate has surged dramatically as a result of the uncontrolled movement of people across the border without appropriate public health measures being taken. Farm and ranch families in my state and elsewhere along the border have experienced significant damage to their property, including their crops as a result of the surge. I consider that an agricultural issue too and deserves attention at this hearing. And finally, Senator Sinema, Senator from Arizona, and I have introduced the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, as you know, Mr. Chairman, which would help restore order to the border region by establishing regional processing centers in high traffic areas and by prioritizing migrants' asylum claims in the immigration courts. So I hope the committee will not shy away from addressing the crisis on the southwest border, which I think will be an absolutely essential element of any immigration reform that ultimately can pass Congress. And I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to advance bipartisan immigration and border security solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Senator Feinstein and Senator Tillis have asked for a moment opening statement. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this. This is a really important bill for California. It's estimated that we have about 280,000 people that would be affected by it. And last year, as you may know, Mr. Chairman, I did a bill that dealt with this. But it didn't go anywhere. And this year, the House, I really think it has merit and it'll stand the test of time. It passed the House in March, a bipartisan vote of 247 to 174. It allows undocumented farm workers who have worked for years in this country, who have paid their taxes, and who can pass a criminal and security background check to legally remain in the United States and potentially earn a green card. It creates a year-round H-2A visa category that will help industries like dairy, a big industry in my state, that needs more long-term workers. It also creates a pilot program for portable visas that will help states like a big one, California, where workers need to move from region to region according to the schedule of multiple crops. It's a good faith bill that reflects months of careful negotiations between lawmakers, growers, and labor. And all of us know that this isn't easy to do. What I like about it is it's comprehensive in scope, it's measured in its objectives, and it has bipartisan support. Most importantly, it gives farmers the help they need, and it protects essential farm workers who work hard to put food on our tables. So I just want to say that I'm delighted that you've scheduled this. I thank you and the ranking member, and I strongly support the balanced and thoughtful approach. One step is done because it's effectively passed the House, and we might just get something done. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, thank you for being here. I have got a National Defense Authorization Act markup that I have to go to, and I'll be there for late into the evening. But this is a very important subject to me. I hadn't intended to speak, but I felt like I had to come down here and weigh in on what I consider to be a very important subject. First off, I think you should be very proud of getting an A rating in your confirmation. 92-7 is a a very strong indication that both Republicans and Democrats have a lot of confidence in your ability in leading the department. But Mr. Chairman, I think that I heard last night, I received an email where some pundit on the right says that our immigration negotiation discussions are dead. That's not true. I heard about a week ago some pundit on the left talking about if we did nothing more than legalize and double the salaries of those working in the fields, we would fix the problem. That's not true either. What we have is a working group here that's trying to put together a set of policies that will get the immigrant farm workers over the finish line, get DACA over the finish line, take a look at those who haven't enrolled in DACA, potentially get them over the finish line, and actually work to solve a decades-old problem where we get to the 1 yard line and we fumble. And we have done that for decades. We made a mistake when we did amnesty, as Senator Grassley talked about, without dealing with border security. And I think that we can do it in a way that makes sense. I've had very productive discussions with members on the other side of the aisle that let's make sure that we've got technology and infrastructure to interdict illicit materials, human trafficking, but get more people across the border legally every single day. Use that same technology to have more guest workers come to this country, work, and then go home. I really wonder if we'd taken the time to get the guest worker programs right, if many of the people here that we're talking about today who are legally present, if they knew that they could come from the country of their birth and where many family members live, that they would come here and work and go back home and come here and work and go back home again. And then some of them may want to seek a path to citizenship. So we have to recognize that an amnesty for immigrant workers is something that should be on the table for discussion. But to do it in a vacuum and not understand and recognize the need to take care of guest worker programs, we're going to swing and we're going to miss again. We're going to fumble on the 1 yard line again. And if we just simply get in a room together and recognize that border security is a problem, it's something that we should work on. And it can be done on a reasonable basis. It would be done differently if the numbers in the Senate were wrong and the party in the White House are different, and the party in the White House was different. But let's play the hand that we're dealt. Let's figure out a way to come up with a reasonable way to take care of the needs of the farm. The concerns that I have with the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is that some of those who are on its face support it may not recognize what could happen on the backside. And by the way, Mr. Chair, I've got 2 letters from the North Carolina Growers Association and Sweet Potatoes that I would like to enter into the record expressing their concerns with the Workforce Modernization Act. But let me just tell the farmers out there, let's say, here's the good news. Those illegally present people are now going to have a path to citizenship, maybe along the lines of a DACA program, which probably makes sense given what Senator Padilla said about many of them having worked here for a decade or more. So the farmer thinks that they've solved their labor problem, only to find out that a provision in the Modernization Act now accounts for a private right of action for your guest workers where you could be sued. So the good news is you've got some stability with your workforce. The bad news is now a whole cottage industry could be created so that farmer is now, they got the workers, but now they have to spend a lot of their time going and defending themselves against frivolous lawsuits. These are the things that we need to talk about, and these are the things that I think can be worked out. And I believe it needs to be done. I don't believe in Big C because I'm a reader of history, and Big C comprehensive immigration reform has failed miserably every time it's been attempted. But I've used the term little c. I'm prepared to look at the right and the people in the ivory towers that say, we don't have a worker problem here. You know, all you got to do is just make sure you go out and get that indigenous workforce. It doesn't exist. Get out of your ivory tower and go talk to the farmers. Go talk to a surviving spouse of a farmer who committed suicide because they couldn't make their generations-old farm work anymore. And to the left, I would say, go to your local Harris Teeter like I did over the weekend. I went into the seafood section and I saw East Coast wild-caught shrimp, $12.99 a pound. Argentinian red shrimp, $8.99 a pound. If you continue to heap regulatory and labor costs on these farmers, I agree that immigrant farm workers are essential to feeding America, but I also believe that farmers are essential to feeding America. And we have to get the numbers right. But I want to make it very, very clear. I'm not going to stop talking with members on the other side of the aisle who are serious about fixing this problem and willing to accept a compromise that can get 60 votes in the Senate and make progress for the first time since Queen was still topping the charts. So, Mr. Secretary, I apologize for not being here to ask you. I've got a lot of questions, but I would like to reserve the opportunity to get with you and talk about these things because I believe you understand these issues, and I know the people on the second panel do. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continuing to work with you to actually come up with a solution. And Senator Feinstein, thank you for all the work and the collaboration we've had. This is the Congress where we should get this done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tillis, thank you, and I'm sorry you have a conflict and have to go to another committee meeting. I would like to clarify two things. There is no new cause of action created in this Farm Worker Modernization Act. It codifies an existing cause of action that is on the books already.
I was speaking specifically to the H-2A program, which is still going to be essential after we make the illegally present population farm workers, because you're going to have some of that population leave the farms after they get citizenship, and rightly so, pursue their American dream. And if we don't have a backstop for making sure that we have a reliable H-2A and H-2B program, we're going to have a problem.
Thank you. I might also add that in 2005, when the Senate was in Republican control, it overwhelmingly passed a bipartisan reconciliation bill that dramatically increased the number of immigrant green cards. So I hope we can find a pathway for a bipartisan effort, and I thank you so much for the work that you've put into that. But the reconciliation option was used by the other party in 2005. I now want to welcome U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Thank you for coming before the Judiciary Committee. Previously served as Secretary from 2009 to 2017 under President Obama, worked to strengthen the ag economy, build rural communities, create new markets for innovation in rural America. He was confirmed, as Senator Tillis noted, by an overwhelming margin as part of this Biden administration in February. We're going to have 5-minute rounds for the Secretary and then the same type of rounds for the second panel, which will come before us. So let me start officially, Secretary Vilsack, asking if you'll stand to be sworn. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the truth so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that the Secretary answered in the affirmative as I expected. Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much. And to Senator Grassley and to the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think it's only fair, since you all are going to ask me questions, that I ask you a set of questions at the outset. What industry in the United States basically provides all of the food needs for 323 million Americans and still has enough food left over to export nearly 20 to 30% to the rest of the world? What industry basically provides the opportunity for American families to enjoy something that no other set of families around the world enjoys, which is spending the least amount of their disposable income on food? The American family spends approximately 10% of their income on food. If you go to any other developed nation, you'll see it in the 20 to 25% range. In developing countries, it might be as much as 50%. What industry supports, directly or indirectly, 40 million American jobs and is responsible for nearly 20% of the United States economy, according to a recent Dunham Associates study? Well, that industry is the food and agriculture industry that we're here to talk about. At the same time, that industry is served by a number of workers, and it has been pointed out today that among them are farm workers. Nearly 2.4 to 2.5 million workers who work incredibly hard, and as been pointed out by this committee, are now considered to be essential workers in an industry that I would articulate and argue is also an essential industry to the future of the United States. Who are these people? Well, they are indeed people who have been in this country for an incredibly long period of time. The average, as Senator indicated, is roughly 18 years of longevity in this country working. Half, maybe as much as 70% of these workers may well be undocumented workers. 83% of them are Hispanic or Latino. They work long hours, 8, 10, 12, 14-hour shifts, 5, 6, 7 days a week. Their income, on the average, is below either at or well below the poverty line. And they are dedicated to family. Let me share with you one story that was shared with me in upstate New York last week at an immigration discussion I had. An individual who has worked in this country for 20 years. I asked him what his hope and dream and aspiration was 5 years from now or 10 years from now. He said, Mr. Secretary, very simply, I would like to see my family. I said, what do you mean? He said, I haven't seen my family for 20 years. I'm concerned that if I leave the country, I won't be able to get back. So when we talk about family values, I think these farm workers are folks who understand and appreciate the essential nature of family values. They come up here to make a better living and send resources back to their families with the understanding that they may never, ever see them again. Why is that? Well, it's in part because we have an uncertain, and I think we can argue, a broken immigration system. The availability of H-2A workers is always in question. Wage increases or decreases are fluctuating from year to year in an uncertain path. There is a cumbersome process involved. There are uneven worker protections. And again, these are separated from families. What can we do about this? Well, the House of Representatives decided to take matters into their hands in March, as they did in 2019, by passing the Farm Worker Modernization Act. And this is an act that simplifies and streamlines the H-2A process and indeed creates a year-long workforce opportunity. Creates a certified ag worker classification for those who have worked in this country for at least 180 days over the last 2 years. Clarifies and defines wage increases and decreases to provide long-term stability to producers. Improves housing opportunities for workers without burdening the producers with additional costs. Phases in a full-time E-Verify system. Provides worker protections. Streamlines the process for more dispute resolution and emergency appeals from producers. And indeed provides a pathway to legitimacy after the payment of a fine, the taxes, and making sure that they can pass a criminal background check. I'm here today simply to advocate on behalf of American agriculture and these workers to plead with the Senate to fix this broken system, to maintain the capacity of this great food and agriculture industry to continue to provide the benefits that we all enjoy in this country, and at the same time to provide the respect and dignity so hard to make this system what it is today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. And I might just add that the Farm Workforce Modernization Act provides for workers to get a 5-year certified agriculture worker visa to work in U.S. agriculture. If they can establish with that visa that they've had 10 years of prior work in agriculture, then they can apply for a green card after waiting 4 years, and then will wait 5 more years before they could possibly have naturalization. So the criticism that during the Reagan administration, the legislation gave them a status that had them leaving agriculture very quickly, seems to be addressed by the timetable that I've just laid out for you here. If you are the worker you ran into in New York, even if he wanted to go through this system in order to become a legal citizen and stop worrying about crossing the border and never getting back, as I understand it, if he spent 20 years in agriculture, okay, he meets the 10-year requirement. Then he has to wait 4 more years. And at that end of 4 years, he gets a green card. And then he waits 5 years to be eligible for naturalization if he chooses that route. So you have at least a minimum of 9 years in agriculture. As I understand it, maybe I'm mistaken, but as I understand it, 9 years a minimum working in agriculture before citizenship.
Senator, that's correct, and I think it's reflective of the fact that this is a compromise piece of legislation where folks on both sides of this legislation gave. Workers certainly gave, producers certainly gave in an effort to try to find common ground.
Key point, these two groups have not historically always been on the same page. We know that, and I won't go into that history. It's well documented, but in this case, they worked out an agreement between them. Certainly, the producers understood they need ag labor. So they were prepared to come up with a process leading to citizenship, naturalization, but it is over time, even for the veteran farm workers. Let me ask you to reflect for a moment, Mr. Secretary. Your state of Iowa, next to my state of Illinois, have many things in common in terms of the crops we grow and the life in our rural communities. Would you reflect for a moment on the state of agriculture in Iowa as it relates to this issue of migrant farm workers and those who are coming in to take jobs related to food production? I can tell you that we have a witness in the next panel, Lene Kustra. Thank you for being here. She is from a dairy family, and I've had dairy farmers tell me that unless you're lucky enough to have a bunch of kids who want to hang around the farm, by and large, you need workers to come in to milk those cows twice a day to keep the farm operation, dairy farm, operating. Same thing true in the orchards of southern Illinois. If they don't have workers coming in to pick those crops, they will literally go out of business. One particular owner of an orchard said, "Senator, don't tell me to hire local people. I'm trying to get a high school kid to work in the stand out by the highway where we sell the fruit. It's air conditioned, and I still can't get a worker to do it." So it's an indication of the challenges they face. Have you seen the same thing in Iowa or other parts of the Midwest?
I have, Senator, and I was thinking of a conversation I had recently with a dairy farmer who indicated that he was the third generation. But he said, the reality is our family wasn't large enough to be able to deal with the expansion of our operation. So we had to hire additional workers. And they became part of our family. He perceives and sees these workers, the 9 people that now work on his farm, as part of his family. That same panel that I listened to included the president of the New York Farm Bureau, as well as a representative of the Vegetable Grower Association in New York. And they basically shared the fact that they put out a advertisement for additional workers. They didn't get a single response. Not a single person responded to the ad for additional opportunities to work in this industry. So it is clear that this industry is dependent on immigrant workers. It's very clear. There are numerous examples of situations where requests were made for U.S. workers to work in these difficult jobs with very little response, if any.
And talk about the meat and poultry processing industries. In areas of Illinois where we have those plants, we also have a remarkably large number of immigrant workers from Africa. Only in Springfield, 200 miles south of Chicago, as you know, it's not uncommon to have 2 or 3 from Africa who work at the meat processing plant not far from Springfield. The same thing is true of Hispanics.
This is a reoccurring story of our history. Immigrant labor comes in and does the difficult, challenging work that the rest of us are not interested in doing. They do it well, and they have the notion of being able to supply opportunity for a better life for their family. I mean, this is replayed every single day in those meatpacking facilities, every single day on those farm fields, Senator. These are people that care deeply about their family. They're sacrificing, working hard to make sure their family has a better life. That's the story here. And we need to figure out something that allows them to have that connection with their family that the rest of us enjoy every single day.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Secretary Vilsack, for being here. And while I'm glad to see you here, I'm kind of disappointed that Secretary Mayorkas isn't here as well, because the H-2A program is a major guest worker program that's administered by the Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security and not by your department. If we're going to have a hearing about H-2A, Secretary Mayorkas should also be here to answer our questions. If he was here, I'd ask him on about a June 3rd letter that he and you, Secretary Vilsack, and Interior Secretary Holland received from the American Farm Bureau Federation and all 50 state farm bureaus relating to the current border crisis and increase in immigration illegally crossing our border. And I'd ask to put that letter in the record at this point. The letter notes that farming and ranching families on the border are, quote, bearing the brunt of this unprecedented influx and have never seen a more dire situation, end of quote. The letter went on to say that farming families have experienced damage to their crops and property, which has caused financial hardship. More importantly, the letter highlighted quote, the security and safety of these families are at stake given the current circumstances, end of quote. The letter concluded by urging the Biden administration to, quote, recognize the crisis and take swift action. Mr. Secretary, since the letter was also addressed to you, I'm not going to ask you if you read it because you get a lot of mail, but I do direct you to that letter, and I just described some of that in that letter. So this brings me to my first question with you, and it's based on the proposition that I don't know for sure if there's any programs in the Department of Agriculture that can help these farmers, and I don't know even if these farmers ask for any help. But is the USDA currently taking any action to help farming families who have experienced damage to their crops and property as a result of the border crisis? And if not, did you have any plans to do that?
Senator, we are asking our NRCS folks to take a look at whether or not the conservation programs that we have could potentially provide some assistance and help in terms of debris removal and repair of fences and so forth that have been damaged. I have seen the letter. I've read the letter. Certainly I've talked also as well to President Duvall, who's the president of the American Farm Bureau, about this issue on a couple of occasions. So we are taking a look at ways in which, from a financial perspective, we might be able to provide assistance and help to those families.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very positive response to my question. My next question and last subject I'll bring up about H-2A access for year-round agricultural employers. As you know, this is a major issue for a number of ag industries in our home state of Iowa. What are your views on expanding the H-2A program to cover year-round agricultural workers, such as animal agriculture and agricultural processing? Because right now it's limited to dairy and I think a 20,000 person cap, I believe.
I was pleased to see in the proposal an expansion and a creation of this opportunity. As I understand it, Senator, and I could be wrong, I believe there's a phase-in over a period of 3 years of 60,000 additional H-2A workers, and there's also a pilot program that focuses on year-round, or excuse me, not year-round, it focuses on the ability of workers to sort of move around the country of 10,000. I know that dairy is very interested in that long-term, year-round. National Milk Producers Federation is supportive of this, as are, I might add, roughly 80 ag groups who have worked collaboratively with the farm worker unions to work on this bill. So I think there is a process. I think there's an opportunity for us to see how that staged-in increase works, and to determine at that point in time whether or not additional adjustments need to be made. So there is a process, and we're certainly appreciative of that.
I think maybe you just asked my last question, but I want to state it for the record anyway, if you got anything to add. I know that you're generally supportive of this legislation, but what is your response to employers, including Iowa-based employers on our next witness panel, who have expressed concern about how the bill addresses H-2A access to year-round employees and the bill's cap on H-2A workers for year-round employers?
I think the key, Senator, is to give us an opportunity to see whether or not this phased-in approach works. I would point out that there is a number of reforms and streamlining of the process, a reduction, an online registry, for example, the ability to not have to have repeat applications to get workforce from time to time during the course of the year. So I think there are a series of important improvements to the H-2A system. I think it would be an opportunity for us to see how this works. And obviously, if there are problems with we can always tweak and modify. But I think first and foremost, you want to learn to walk before you run, and that phased-in approach allows us to learn to walk before we run.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Under current law, the wage rate for H-2A workers is usually set, as I understand it, by the adverse effect wage rate, sometimes called the super minimum wage. That rate can vary considerably between regions and fluctuate from one season to the next, creating uncertainty for both employers and workers. The Farm Workers Modernization Act, if passed, would freeze the rate for 1 year and then put caps on the amount it can go up or down for the next 9 years. Does this act do enough to ensure that growers can anticipate the wages they will need to pay workers?
Senator, I think it does. And I would point out that the current wage rate on average for those folks who are earning that wage is roughly a little over $13 an hour, which is significantly below the average wage of a typical American worker, also below the wage that even a worker with the lowest educational level in our economy would earn. Again, back to the individuals I talked to in New York, it was interesting to me that they were working for $13 an hour and hadn't had a raise in 3 years. This does provide some stability and a range in which both producers and workers can work with. And I think it also provides and directs me and Secretary Mayorkas, Department of Homeland Security, to take a look at that calculation and that method over that 9 to 10 year period and determine whether or not there's some more permanent fix that could be put in place. But it's certainly an improvement over the current state, which creates uncertainty for everyone.
While most farm workers are already protected by the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, H-2A workers are not. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act, if passed, would change that. The Farm Worker Modernization Act, if passed, would change that by expanding MSPA to include H-2A workers. So here are 2 questions. Does the Farm Workforce Modernization Act do enough to protect workers from exploitation and abuse by employers?
I think it provides an opportunity for consistency and clarity in terms of those protections. I think that there are additional ways in which this bill provides assistance and help. I mentioned housing in my initial comment. That's also an issue in addition to wages, in addition to working conditions. These folks basically deserve decent housing. That's obviously can be a fairly expensive proposition. The bill, I think, provides and directs the Department of Agriculture to invest additional resources that would be provided under this bill to expand housing opportunities. So I think on balance, and everything about this bill is on balance, because at the end of the day, this represents between producers and workers. They worked long and hard on this, and I think it deserves our vote of confidence to allow it to see what it works, see what works well, what doesn't work. As you all know, no bill is ever perfect, but I think the fact that this is a compromise between people who historically have had a difficult time finding common ground, we should be encouraging that kind of activity, I would think. And so whether it's sufficient or not, time will tell, but I think it's certainly an improvement over where it is today.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here today and for your testimony. I particularly appreciate your reaching out to me and other members here to see what's possible in this space. As a practical person and somebody who's been a governor of the state, you understand the legislative process is perhaps by design difficult because you have to build consensus, and that's always particularly been a challenge in this area. And I would share the views that Senator Tillis earlier expressed, where comprehensive immigration reform certainly has never been successful in the time I've been here in the Senate. And I think the best way for us to try to do this is to take smaller pieces on an incremental basis and find consensus where we can, but then use that as a confidence-building measure to then allow us to do other things. I'm not suggesting we stop at the farm labor position. And I've asked Senator Durbin to consider putting a bill in the committee for markup on the DACA population, 640,000 or so young people who now have a great deal of uncertainty as a result of a federal court decision last year saying the original executive memorandum issued by Secretary Napolitano during the Obama administration was not legally effective to present them a work permit and deferred action. But I wanted to just have a conversation maybe, or at least about the best path forward. I know everybody's frustrated by our lack of progress in the immigration space. Our Democratic colleagues now apparently are going to rely on the budget process in order to try to pass immigration reform. I have a different point of view from that of the chairman. The Senate rules are not self-executing, and the so-called precedent he points to in 2005, there was no objection based on the Byrd rule, which is, I know, getting down in the weeds. So my personal opinion is, and I think it's shared by many people, including the former Senate parliamentarian, is it's not going to be possible for us to do immigration reform in the context of the budget, which is what apparently our Democratic colleagues have in mind. So my simple request would be for you and the administration to continue to work with us to try to do this using the normal legislative process. I know building bipartisan support for legislation is hard work. That's why so many people avoid it, except as a last resort. But it's very important, I think, for us to provide some stability to our broken immigration system. I think you used those words. I would agree with you. But part of what's happening at the border right now is simply unacceptable and needs to be addressed. Senator Sinema, Henry Cuellar, Democrat from Laredo, and Tony Gonzalez and I have introduced the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act in order to provide some suggestion to the administration and others about where the administration might land on that issue rather than try to ignore it, which appears to be what they are doing now. So I would like to try to find a way to be constructive in this area. It's enormously frustrating because we haven't been successful, but I'm, for one, am committed to keep trying. And I would ask you to continue to work with us and encourage folks on both sides of the aisle, as well as the administration, to stay engaged with Congress to try to solve these problems through the normal legislative process rather than resort to this partisan budget process, which I believe will have 0% chance of success. Thank you.
Did you have a question? Oh, thank you very much.
I believe I can use my time to make a statement.
Of course.
Or request or ask questions.
Or you can put a question mark at the end of a statement. Your choice.
It is my choice. Thank you.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you, Senator Cornyn, for those relevant and direct comments about the urgency, the importance of our finding a bipartisan way forward. And thank you, Chairman Durbin, for your continued leadership of a bipartisan group of senators who meet week after week and are trying to find a pathway forward. And thank you, Secretary Vilsack, for presenting so concisely to us the opportunity we have in front of us with this piece of legislation. Legislation hammered out by groups that do not often come to the same table, those representing farm workers and farmers, those representing very different points of interest in the agricultural community. As you pointed out, we owe the very food on our tables to the farm workers who've labored during this pandemic in remarkably difficult circumstances, working through extreme weather, working through the challenges of this pandemic, and to the farmers and processors who employ them. And we have a badly broken immigration system around farm labor and farm production and processing in our country. And I can think of no better way to honor the contributions of the essential workers in our farms and in our country than by showing them that their continued hard work under the sun can earn them a place in our society outside the shadows of being undocumented and disengaged from our communities and our country. So I look forward to working with you and to both Democrats and Republicans to try and advance this promising and important piece of legislation. This is an issue close to my heart. In Delaware, we have one of the greatest concentrations of chicken processing in the country. We grow soybeans and corn to feed those chickens. It's 42% of the land area of little old Delaware that's in agriculture. It generates about, I think, $1.5 billion a year, which is tiny compared to Iowa, but big for my state. And we have long struggled to come up with the right balance of who's working and under what conditions and how and why. And this would help move that forward. Delaware farms do not use a huge number of H-2A visas, but they rely on H-2A workers to get their products processed and to market. And for years, I've heard from farmers in Delaware and across the Delmarva Peninsula that the H-2A application process is too complex, too time-consuming, too costly. In fact, some farmers have told me directly they have to hire a consultant just to get through that process. So farmers agree across the country it's time to modernize and reform this antiquated system so we've got a legal pathway for folks to come here. I just spent 2 days in Guatemala with a bipartisan group of senators. And one of the things we heard from the president to advocates and activists was we need a better legal pathway for folks to come to this country to put pressure back on those who are trafficking illegally folks into this country. Can you speak to how this House bill would help address issues like this, make the H-2A program more predictable and transparent, and provide legal pathways for farm workers in this country?
I'd be happy to, Senator. Thanks for the question. Current process requires multiple filings in order to qualify and to obtain H-2A workers. This proposal would basically limit, instead of 3 filings, it would limit it to a single filing. The current process requires if you have a growing season where you want to bring the workforce in at the beginning of the growing season and then bring them back at the end of the growing season, you've got to go through the process not once but twice. This basically would allow for one petition to cover the entire growing season, so you wouldn't have to do it more than one time. It also provides, the current law provides classify ads and a series of steps to try to quantify that you've tried to hire people from this country. This essentially would provide an online job registry, which would make it easier to satisfy that criteria as well. So in that case, it simplifies, it reduces the paperwork and burden, and I think it reduces the cost associated with the current system.
You've been the governor of Iowa. You've been the Secretary of Agriculture. You are now again the Secretary of Agriculture. Is it your testimony to us today that this may be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make right how immigration and our farming industry and community and society interacts in a way that provides real opportunity for us?
Senator, for the first time in a long, long time, I think the country as a whole, not individual senators who understand the importance of this industry, the country as a whole now understands and appreciates the nature of our food and agriculture industry and are appreciative of it. Having said that, there are many aspects of that system that are broken. Just to give you one statistic, 89.6% rate the majority of income from the farming operation for the farm family. Right. We got to begin the process of constructing a stronger foundation for this system, and part of that stronger foundation is a better ag worker system.
Thank you. Let me close with this. As the co-chair of the Bipartisan Chicken Caucus, I was proud to work with my colleagues, including a fellow member from South Carolina, to include...
Am I on it? Am I on that caucus?
Yes, you are.
Oh, good.
To include direct payments to chicken growers for the first time. Part of the USDA's response to COVID-19 was to broaden your aperture in terms of who's eligible and who's able to work with direct payment programs. And for the very first time, contract growers for chicken are included. I just want to thank you for working with me on that and for making this critical additional support for farm families in Delaware possible. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Senator Coons. And I understand there's open enrollment for the Chicken Caucus.
Yeah.
We're taking all comers because there's chicken in every state.
Get Chick-fil-A by the end
Senator
of the day.
Graham.
Okay, thank you. Well, you are what you eat. So bottom line, I appreciate you coming, Mr. Secretary. Is the southern border secure?
I think it's fair to say, Senator, that there are ways in which we can improve.
No, that's not the question. Is it secure?
Well,
if you can't figure this out,
no.
Is that a hard question?
Well, it can be a hard question.
Well, it's not today because a million people came across at all-time highs with no end in sight. If we legalize one person under this program, which I've been historically for, how will it affect border security? Will there be a run on the border?
I don't believe so. In fact,
you don't believe so. You don't believe that if we give legal status to hundreds of thousands of people without first securing the border, there won't be a rush on the border?
I don't believe so.
Why?
Well, in large part because the people we're talking about within the ag workforce are people that have been here for a long period of time.
Do you understand pull factors?
I understand the nature of this workforce. I also understand the
Do
nature
you
of the work.
understand that if you give legal status to one person without first securing the border, you're going to have a run on the border 10 times worse?
No,
than
I don't believe so.
You don't believe that?
No, and the reason I don't is because I think the primary
I just think that's ludicrous. I think I've been involved in every immigration bill there has been, and we always secured the border first because of this very reason. You don't give amnesty and hope people won't keep coming. You secure the border, then you provide legal status. We're doing it ass backwards. And Mr. Chairman, you know, we've had our differences. I like you a lot. We've had 2 committee hearings about legalizing people. We haven't had one hearing yet about the status of the border. And if you don't believe legalization through DACA or ag workers will create a run on the border, you're not listening to the people at the border. When I was chairman, you asked me, your committee did, the Democrats asked me to have hearings about the status of confinement, the way kids were being treated. We had 3 different hearings with the Department of Homeland Security acting director to come so you could ask questions about conditions of confinement and our policies on the border. I have asked for a hearing. Senator Grassley's asked for a hearing. There's no way in hell we can legalize anybody until we first understand the effect it would have on the border and whether or not it would incentivize further illegal immigration. And Mr. Secretary, you're a fine man. I think you're very good at your job. But if you can't figure out that legalization without first securing the border doesn't create a problem, then you really don't understand this issue. And Mr. Chairman, when you asked me to do things that some of my people didn't want to do, we did it. We had hearings. It is now time for this oversight committee to have a hearing about what the hell happened at our border. In December 2020, we had the lowest crossings, illegal crossings, in 45 years. Now, 6 months later, we have an explosion of illegal immigration, no end in sight because of policy changes by the Biden administration, I believe. But it's imperative that this committee do oversight over a broken border to try to figure out what the hell happened in the last 6 months. And if we did some of the things being suggested by the Secretary and by other people about legalizing any population, what effect would it have on illegal immigration? My belief is it would lead to an explosion of illegal immigration. And I'll ask you again, tell me why, if we legalized hundreds of thousands of workers, which I'm willing to do, without first securing the border, you don't believe it would create further border security problems. Explain that.
Do you want an explanation?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. I think primary reason why people are crossing the border, Senator, is because they've got a very difficult experience economically back home. So first and foremost, if you're truly interested in securing the border,
I'll stop you right there. What happened in the last 6 months?
You asked me to respond, and I'm going to respond.
Okay, good. Go ahead and finish, and I'll follow up.
Fair enough. If you're truly serious about that piece of it, then I think we have to take a look at how we can help create better opportunities south of our border.
So you don't believe catch and release has had an effect on the surge in illegal immigration?
You ask a question about the agriculture workforce.
But you've given answers about immigration.
Well, no, I'm asking. I'm here to talk.
No, you answered that the key is to give more money to the Triangle countries.
No,
is that the key?
The key is helping them build their own economy.
We've been trying to do that for years.
I don't know how well we've been trying to do it. But I will tell you this.
You don't believe the change in policy has affected a wave of illegal immigration? You don't believe eliminating remaining in Mexico has affected a surge of people seeking asylum claims?
It's a complicated issue.
No, it's not.
Yes,
it's not
it is,
complicated
Senator.
at all.
Now, Senator, you know it's complicated.
Well,
you know it's complicated.
You're making no, it's not. It's really simple.
It is. Yeah, no, it's not simple.
So
it's
let
not
me
simple.
just
It's
say
very
this.
complicated.
Put a fine point on it. What the hell has happened in the Triangle countries in 6 months, where we went from the lowest illegal crossings coming from that part of the world to the highest?
The pandemic and food shortages.
So that's what you believe. It's not changing the policy of remain in Mexico, abolishing the idea that you have to wait in Mexico, you're not released into the country. You can't figure out that when the the Biden administration canceled remain in Mexico, they'll let you come into the country and they release you into the country and you never show up for your hearing, that catch and release program. Have you ever talked to the Border Patrol about this? Have you ever had a discussion about the pull factors with the Border Patrol? Have you ever had one? Yes or no?
Yes.
When?
My first stint.
When was that?
Well, I don't remember the year, sir.
Okay, has it been in the last 10 years?
It may have been.
Has it been the last year?
No.
Okay. Go talk to them and you'll find out how wrong you are if you talk to them.
Well,
the last oversight hearing in the Judiciary Committee under the previous chairman was on a subcommittee hearing on January 16th, 2018, 2.5 years ago. President Biden has been in office officially yesterday, I think 6 months. So in terms of oversight of the Department of Homeland Security, there is a record of a hearing 2.5 years ago. I would also add that I called this hearing with Senator Padilla because most Americans will be sitting down to dinner tonight through the weekend and enjoying food that's being picked to a large part by migrant farm workers, and we're trying to figure out a way to deal with this. And if the premise is that we can't do anything on immigration until we do everything on immigration, we'll be right where we've been for 36 years, doing nothing.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
You may.
On March the 6th, 2019, we held an oversight hearing with Customs and Border Protections responding to the smuggling of persons at the southern border. On June 2nd, 2020, we had an oversight hearing entitled Examining Best Practices for Incarceration and Detention During COVID-19. We've had, I've called the acting DHS secretary twice because you were concerned about families being separated. So was I. You cannot understand this issue until you have a hearing on the border and how legalization would affect the wave of illegal immigration. If you don't secure your border first, Mr. Chairman, then you're going to incentivize more illegal immigration. That's why every bill you and I have worked on had border security as the first thing. And to the Secretary of Agriculture, you're a fine man. I want to work with you on this program, but you need to go talk to the Border Patrol, because if you spend 15 minutes talking with them, they will tell you that the pull factors have been created in the last 6 months. And if we legalize one person, the worst is yet to come.
I stand by my statement. The last DHS oversight hearing in this committee was 2.5 years ago. There have been specific issues that have been raised. And I will tell you, and you know as well as I do, when we worked on the Gang of Eight to put together a bill, it included a dramatic commitment for border security, more money than any of us had ever imagined. And of course, it was not approved on the House side when the other party was in control. I am just loath to accept the premise that until you solve everything, you can't discuss anything. Workers and border security, and I don't think they're exclusive. I think they can be done together. At least I hope they can be. The next question comes from Senator Klobuchar, who is joining us virtually.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Durbin. And I was thinking back to all the work that you and in the early days, Senator Graham did on immigration. And in fact, I remember as a brand new senator, the work that was being done when President Bush was in to try to get immigration reform passed. And those bills were path to citizenship bills. As you noted, over time included a lot of security money for the border. And some of my earliest memories are of Secretary Gutierrez coming in and meeting with Senator Graham and Senator McCain and a number of Democrats that were involved in this effort, Senator Kennedy, and I got to be there as part of history, and I vowed we would get this done. Then when President Obama came in, again, supported by a number of Republicans and finally passed in the US Senate with Senator Grassley's support, we passed immigration reform. And the time is now. And I want to get back to what the core is of this. For me, it comes down to, yes, there are moral issues. Yes, there are humanitarian issues. But for me in my state right now, it's economic issues. And that's why I think you're here, Secretary Vilsack. My state has a strong economy, relatively low unemployment rate. We don't have enough people for the work that needs to be done. It's really that simple, not in our resorts and most significantly, not in our ag areas. And for certain agricultural employers like dairies, which has been pointed out, pork producers, forestry, seasonal visas just don't meet the needs. And that's why I am a fan of this year-round proposal. It's part of the immigration reform, the U.S. Citizenship Act that I am a co-sponsor of with Senator Menendez, but it's also the work that came out of the House. Can you talk, Mr. Secretary, about the challenges faced by dairies and pork producers when they're trying to meet their year-round workforce needs, when they just have one of these seasonal visas? I've heard a lot. I'd like to hear it from you, from the ground.
Senator, they simply can't find the workers, and the result is that they either have to reduce the amount that they're producing, or they have to destroy that which they've grown because they simply don't have enough people to pick and harvest. This is an issue that goes to the heart of our food supply, goes to the heart of our capacity to have choice in the grocery store. It goes to the ability to have affordable food for all of our country and our ability to export, which supports millions and millions of jobs. At the end of the day, you need workforce to be able to do that, and you need a stable and secure system so you can plan ahead, so you can determine whether or not you are able to expand, able to buy that additional farm, able to expand by buying and expanding your herd. Farmers can't do that today. They can't make those decisions because they don't have the security and the stability of a system that works.
You think that's part of the reason this has been bipartisan? We have Democrats and Republicans representing agricultural areas. I know in the House, the bill that passed was bipartisan, got some significant Republican support. Where's that Republican support coming from? Because if you listen to Senator Graham right now, you would think that there's no movement on immigration, and I just know the opposite from talking to my colleagues.
The folks who worked on this compromise, Senator, on the producer side and on the processor side and on the labor side, represent, I think, the entire political spectrum in this country. Very, very conservative producers in the Southwest and in California. Obviously, progressive folks representing the union and the workers. They came together with this as a compromise bill in an effort to move this forward to strengthen the foundation. And I think that's the reason why you saw bipartisan support in the House, because they knew there were 80 different separate agricultural groups that felt this was a good idea, that felt that this was necessary to get done now.
As a member of the Ag Committee, in addition to this great committee, I've heard from many constituent farmers and groups about the delays in processing of the agriculture worker visa applications that can have a devastating effect. Harvests are missed, payments are delayed, investments need to be put off, as you just pointed out. How would reducing processing delays, such as by streamlining the application process, benefit farmers and consumers?
It would reduce cost. It would provide for a better understanding, and it's very important that it be timely, because at the end of the day, depending upon when you're harvesting, it will depend on the quality of what you are able to sell into the market. So it means real money for farmers to be able to have that stable and secure workforce on time.
Last question, kind of going the next step from the bill, the House bill that just passed, and that is to the larger idea of pathway to citizenship. In a previous hearing in the Immigration Subcommittee, Republican witness, Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eaton, testified about the economic benefits, not just to affected immigrants, but to all Americans, of a pathway to citizenship. And to qualify, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act requires that an immigrant pay federal taxes. How would expanded tax revenues, not just for the federal government, but for state and local governments, benefit all Americans?
Well, as you well know, budgets basically fund everything from education to job training to public safety to a wide variety of state and local government responsibilities. So obviously, to the extent you've got additional resources, you can keep the tax base lower for everyone, and you can continue to have the essential services that people depend on. And so it makes sense, obviously, for folks to come out of the shadows to be able to pay their taxes without fear of deportation or without fear of disruption on the farm.
I think that's why, and Senator Durbin, just my last statement here, I think that's why when you look at the incredible debt reduction you would get with comprehensive immigration reform, even though we're focused here on the year-round visas, it's one of the big benefits. It was the reason that Grover Norquist way back supported the immigration bill under President Obama, because of the debt reduction you'd see and the enormous benefit to taxpayers. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Senator Durbin. Thank you for allowing me to appear remotely today.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden border crisis keeps getting worse. Every day, it is getting worse. In my home state of Texas, on the southern border, we have seen over 500,000 illegal crossings this year. We are on a pace to have over 2 million people cross the border illegally. And this is the direct result of decisions made by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. 3 decisions made in the opening week of this administration caused this crisis. Number 1, the first week in office, Joe Biden immediately halted construction of the border wall. Number 2, he reinstated the failed policy of catch and release. And number 3, most indefensibly, he ended the incredibly successful Remain in Mexico international agreement. Remain in Mexico was an agreement President Trump negotiated with the government of Mexico that said that those people who cross into Mexico illegally would remain in Mexico while their asylum cases are pending in the United States. And it worked tremendously. Last year, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. This year, we have the highest rate of illegal immigration in over 20 years. The people of Texas, I'm hearing from people all across Texas. Go to South Texas, talk to mayors, and by the way, talk to Democratic mayors on the border that are dealing with hundreds of thousands of people coming across. Talk to farmers and ranchers who are dealing with coyotes crossing their land on a daily basis, trafficking people, trafficking drugs. Talk to landowners like one rancher I know who had his ranch house broke into and MS-13 painted, spray painted on the walls. And the answer from the Biden administration is they don't care. And I've got to say, Mr. Chairman, it is painful to say the answer from the Democratic Judiciary Committee is the Democratic Judiciary Committee doesn't give a damn. We're not having a hearing about the crisis on the southern border. This is not the first hearing we've had on amnesty. This is not the second hearing we've had on amnesty. This is the third hearing we've had in amnesty in 6 months. These hearings are part of the problem. You know what? All across the world, people are hearing Senate Democrats saying, we're in the business of amnesty. Little boys and little girls are getting physically assaulted by drug traffickers and human traffickers. They're being sexually assaulted by drug traffickers and human traffickers. When I led a group of 19 senators down to the border, we saw one 11-year-old girl who had been raped by the traffickers coming across. On the Rio Grande River, we saw the body of a man who had drowned crossing the river. And the answer, tragically, from the Democrat Judiciary Committee is they don't give a damn. We spent 4 years listening to Democrats run to TV cameras talking about kids in cages. There are more cages, and they are more full today. Joe Biden is running the cages that are packed with kids at the Donna Tent Facility. Built for 1,000 people with COVID restrictions, its capacity is 250 people. Senator Kennedy, when we were down there were over 4,200 people in that facility. 1,700% its capacity. The Biden cages, child after child after child, packed in there, little boys, little girls, not 6 feet apart, as you would want in a pandemic, not 3 feet apart. They weren't even 3 inches apart. They're next to each other. They're sleeping on the floor, no beds, no mats, no cots, wrapped in reflective emergency blankets. The time we were there, the rate of COVID positivity was over 10%. And the Biden administration is releasing illegal aliens into our community who are COVID positive. It is irresponsible, it is wrong, and every Democrat who said to a TV camera, kids in cages, Mr. Chairman, why doesn't this committee have a hearing on the Biden cages? Instead, we have a hearing with the Secretary of Agriculture. Mr. Secretary, if we were having a hearing on the optimum fertilizer for growing corn, I think you might be a very good witness. Does the Department of Agriculture secure the border?
We're not responsible for the law enforcement aspect of this, but
no.
the secure.
No, hold on.
Well, you ask a question.
Allow the
Senator.
witness to answer.
Okay, my question was, do you secure the border? The answer is no.
No.
Do you run the cages?
No.
Do you prosecute the traffickers?
No.
Are you the Attorney General?
No, sir.
Are you the Secretary of Homeland Security?
No, sir.
And with all due respect, your answers on immigration were fertilizer. They were nonsense. Your answer, you said, why are we seeing this crisis? Your answer was poverty. There are 7 billion people on planet Earth, many of whom were poor. And you know what? They were poor last year. And we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. They're poor this year. What's changed is this administration refuses to enforce the law, and Texas is paying the price for it. That's what's changed. Your other answer was the pandemic. Mr. Secretary, last year there was a pandemic, and we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Poverty didn't magically appear on January of 2021, and the pandemic didn't appear on January 2021. What appeared was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and policies that are inhumane, that are cruel, and that are failing.
Senator, was the border secure last year?
Last year, it was the most secure it's been in 45 years.
If that's the case, why didn't you all pass the Ag Modernization Act last year after it passed the House? You're telling me that it's got to secure the border before you pass this act.
Let me be clear. I'm not Lindsey Graham. I don't support this bill. No. Look, I understand that there have been Democrats and Republicans who support amnesty. I ain't one of them.
Why
I get that you want amnesty. I get that your invitation is come to America, forget the legal processes, and everyone
I want a workforce that's going to continue to support the greatest agriculture and food industry in the world. That's what I'd like to have, Senator.
Well, I'll tell you, I thought you wanted him to respond.
Senator, you've taken more time than any other senator this morning. Will you please wrap up?
This is a crisis. This administration caused it, and this committee doesn't even care to have a hearing on the suffering that is happening at the border that is caused by policies that don't work.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Let me see. Senator Padilla is off the vote and will be back shortly, so he will preside at that point and ask questions. I thank Senator Vilsack for his patience. I'm sorry, Senator. Wait, I'm getting virtual information here, and I understand that Senator Booker is available in a virtual.
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. I'm really grateful for you recognizing me. I'm also grateful for the Secretary of Agriculture. He and I haven't agreed across the board on things, but he is such a man of civility and dignity, and I know he is open to all senators to engage in constructive dialogue, especially on things that we agree on in this country and need to move forward. So I just want to give him a tribute. I know these hearings aren't always easy, but he has been so accessible in having substantive conversations about issues that matter to millions of Americans, and worked very hard with me and others to find common ground. Today is a day that I just especially want to celebrate his dignity and civility and his willingness to roll up his sleeves and work with anybody. There are about 2.4 million farm workers in the United States. 3/4 of them are foreign born and half of them are undocumented. It's really undeniable that America relies very heavily on immigrants, documented and undocumented, to keep food on our tables. And from my vantage point, the issues have numerous implications. The sources of our food have humanitarian implications, economic health, and even has been discussed, national security. And so my first question is, Secretary Vilsack, what concerns you most right now about this labor crisis in the agricultural sector? What are some of the things I think that are sort of having you worried and concerned?
A couple of things, Senator. First of all, obviously always concerned about the safety and protection of workers to make sure that they are in safe and decent working conditions. But to the extent that we don't fix this particular broken system, It compromises the ability of us to continue to have this incredibly strong food and agriculture industry. It compromises our ability to have supply. It compromises our ability to have choice. It compromises our ability to have a less expensive food in the grocery store. It compromises our ability to have the jobs that are connected to these workers when they pick the fruit. It has to be processed, it has to be canned, it has to be transported, it has to be stored, it has to be shelved. All of those are jobs that are connected to their work. And so it has a rippling impact and effect on the economy. If we fix this system, then we have stability in that food and ag sector, which obviously provides enormous choice for consumers, less expensive food for consumers, and better jobs and better protections for workers.
Thank you, sir. You know I have a tremendous concern about the growing corporate consolidation in our food system. It's stunning now that about 4 companies control 90% of the global grain market, and the top 4 beef packers in the United States now control 85% of the beef market. We have seen the stunning disappearance of independent family farmers being driven out of business as the market power of these large multinational corporations have transformed American agriculture in a matter of decades. I just want you to know that this is an ongoing, I see as a crisis, and I'm wondering if you could just give for the record your opinion on what this market consolidation, the kind of impact it's having on small family farmers.
Senator, I don't know if you were with us earlier when I indicated that 89.6% of American farms today don't produce the majority of income for the farm families that operate them, which means that these people have to work 2 and 3 jobs to continue to do what they want to do and what they love to do. I think that's one of the reasons why the president signed the executive order on competition. It's one of the reasons why we recently announced utilizing some of the American Rescue Plan resources to expand processing capacity so that we have a more transparent, more competitive, and more open market for our producers. It's one of the reasons why the executive order also directs us to take a look at this issue of consolidation in the seed industry, which we intend to do. All of it's designed to provide opportunities for more competitive markets for farmers so they get better prices, and to make sure that the inputs that go into the production of crops and livestock are reasonably priced and are obtained in a competitive and open market way as well. That's my concern. We've got to make sure that folks at every level, we support diversity in agriculture, the size of operations, the producers, the method of production. I think diversity is a great strength, and we want to see our system stronger and more resilient.
And with a few seconds left, and turn it back over to my friend and our chairman, Dick Durbin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Booker. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I know you want to see our farmers prosper. I want to see our farmers prosper. It appears that, and of course, to prosper, our farmers need labor. And it appears that many of the people who are new to our country want to work as farm laborers. And that's a good thing. And I know there are shortages in that respect. And it seems to me that we ought to figure out a way to work together to achieve that end. The problem, as you know, is our immigration policy. And normally I ask questions, but I just want to spend a second telling you where I'm coming from. I don't completely understand it. Our border's not secure. It's less secure today than it was in December. I think if you go down there, you'll see that. I think we could secure it. You know, Americans have done extraordinary things. We can unravel the human genome. You know, we can take a diseased human heart and replace it with a new one and make it beat. We can send a person to the moon. I suspect we can secure the border. And it seems to me until we do, or certainly get it more secure than it is now, that amnesty is not going to pass in the United States Senate. And here's what perplexes me. If many of my friends who don't support securing the border, not all of them, but many of them, say that vetting people at the border is racist. Now, I think it's prudent, and I think most Americans think it's prudent. But I could understand the racist charge. I wouldn't agree with it, but I could understand it if we didn't have such a robust legal immigration program. We admit about 1 million of our world's neighbors to America every year to become citizens, more than any other country. So, and we make a clear distinction between legal and illegal immigration. And I think most Americans think legal immigration is good and illegal immigration is bad. And it's not because they're racist. I think most Americans see our border as sort of America's front door. And most Americans lock their own front door at night. They don't do that because they hate everybody on the outside. They do that because they love the people on the inside, and they want to know who's coming into their home. They don't want to just keep everybody out. They just want to know who's coming into their home. And that's the way I look at the border, and I don't understand why we can't do that. And I know it's not in your purview, but I just don't understand why the Biden administration doesn't, for example, re-implement the Remain in Mexico program. Of course, Mexico, if you ask them, says we don't like it. But if we trade hard with them, they'll do it. And it does work. It can stem the flow.
Senator, can I ask you a question about what you just said?
Sure.
Several speakers have suggested that this is about amnesty, and I'm puzzled by that. And the reason I'm puzzled by it is this. I used to practice, and I know you were a lawyer, I think, by training. Is that right? I used to practice in a small town, did a little criminal work. Guy would come in, be charged with some petty crime, would go in front of the magistrate. Magistrate would say to me, look, here's the deal. If your guy pays a fine, pays court costs, we'll let him go. Now, I didn't perceive that to be amnesty. I perceived that to be a system that basically created some mechanism for acknowledging wrongdoing, providing something of value. In our criminal justice system, is either you provide your time by being locked away, or you pay a fine, or in some cases you do both.
Yes, sir. So
when this bill provides for the payment of a fine of $1,000, I don't quite understand why we're talking about amnesty.
Okay.
So can you help me understand that?
Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
Briefly.
Because it is amnesty. And I think most Americans see it as amnesty. I see it as amnesty. They see it as you came into our country illegally. You didn't follow the law, as many people do, get in line, wait their turn, fill out the forms. And now, by just paying a fine, you get to jump the line.
No.
And they also know what is going on at the border right now, and people are pouring across. There are a lot of reasons for it, but I know it could be slowed down. And I just think it's a practical matter and also as a principled matter. I'm not going to support any form of amnesty. You and I may disagree on the definition, until I see a concerted effort to secure the border. And clearly, there isn't one. I've been down there, Mr. Secretary. If you go down, you'll see. Now, I don't know the reason for it. I don't know whether it's politics or what, but I know we could do better because in December we were.
But yet, even though that was the case, there was no effort in the Senate to pass this bill before.
Well, it's not just as simple as saying, well, the border we had done a better job in December. The American people, this is what the American people want to see. First of all, they don't trust Washington. There's a reason that you and I and all of us in Washington, D.C. and part of government poll right up there with skim milk. The American people don't trust us. And they want to see a border secured. They want to see a good faith effort on both sides to make sure it's secured for an extended period of time. Yes, the border was more secure in December than it is now, and no fair-minded person can disagree with that. But many of my Democratic friends completely bashed every chance they got the Trump administration for doing that. And so there was no feeling among the American people that this is going to be sustained. I think if we had a bipartisan effort to really secure the border as best we can for a sustained period of time, you would see the American people very sympathetic to a discussion of amnesty and drafting an immigration policy that looks like somebody designed it on purpose.
Thank you.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary, Governor, whatever I should call you.
Thank you. It's now my turn not just to preside, as Senator Durbin is off to vote. He'll return in a few minutes. It's also my opportunity to ask questions before recognizing Senator Ossoff, and then we'll proceed to the second panel. But first, a couple of points of clarification. I think some of my colleagues, through their questioning, through their statements, have caused a little confusion. Not sure if it's intentional or unintentional, but Secretary Vilsack, can you clarify for everybody watching us here today, are you the Secretary of Homeland Security or are you the Secretary of Agriculture?
I'm the Secretary of Agriculture, Senator.
Thank you very much. That's what I thought coming into this hearing. And so I will focus my questions appropriately so on issues of agriculture and the agricultural industry and your portfolio of responsibility. Second, I just feel compelled to respond to some of the comments some of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle have made regarding the appropriateness of considering the reconciliation process to advance the elements of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act or other elements of immigration reform. Their suggestion that this is best done on a bipartisan basis through bipartisan negotiations, which, if I felt they would be fruitful, like we haven't been trying for the last 6 months, but it's clear that while some of our colleagues suggest, well, I support this, I support that, I support Dreamers, I support farm workers, they're quick to raise excuses and pretexts for why we can't do anything. And finally, just can't help but observe the contradiction. I believe it was Senator Durbin described Senator Graham's comments as, well, it makes no sense to say we can't do anything unless you do everything, while Senator Tillis, among others, have suggested, well, when you try to do everything, we've been unsuccessful for years and years and years. So let's sort of ratchet down the scope of what we're trying to do to more of a piecemeal approach. You can't have it both ways. Turn it to agriculture. Mr. Secretary, in 2019, California produced $50 billion in agricultural commodities. California alone. As I mentioned earlier, the state is also a major exporter of agricultural products and makes up 16% of total U.S. agricultural exports, totaling $21.7 billion. In addition, more than 1/3 of the country's fruits and nuts are grown in California, including 80% of the global supply of almonds and nearly 90% of U.S. grown strawberries. Yet California and other states across the country are facing the chronic labor shortage that you've spoken to already. The American Farm Bureau Federation estimates that in total, U.S. agriculture needs 1.5 to 2 million hired workers each year. But farmers are struggling to fill these positions. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, 56% of California farmers reported being unable to find all of the workers they needed for their main crop over the last 5 years. Again, that was prior to COVID. Mr. Secretary, about 400,000 workers represent California's agricultural workforce. More than 60, upwards of 75% of these workers are undocumented. Given the overrepresentation of undocumented immigrants in this industry, how could providing a pathway to legalization for farm workers bolster the U.S. economy and trade relations?
It would provide stability to Western growers, Senator, and that's one of the reasons why the Western growers have been at the front of an effort to try to get this compromise formed and ultimately through the House and to the Senate. I think they recognize that with that stability, they can plan, they can make determinations about expansion opportunities, they can figure out ways in which they can be more productive, which creates more opportunities not only for domestic consumption, but also exports, and in turn supports all of the jobs that are essentially in the supply chain that results from the fruit that's being picked and grown in your state. So at the end, and your state is the #1 agricultural state in terms of productivity, in terms of sales. So obviously anything you all do that can benefit and expand opportunities in California will have a positive impact on agriculture generally. And as I indicated, the agriculture and the food industry is roughly 20% of the American economy. So at the end of the day, it would provide for a more robust and stronger and more stable American economy.
Great. Appreciate your description on the benefits of this act should it become law. Can you shed a little bit more light, describe in slightly more detail, short of passage, what some of the challenges, operational and otherwise, in the agricultural sector because the workforce is not currently stable?
Well, many of the farmers that we're talking about are people, the average age of the American farmer today is nearly 60 years of age. And many of these farmers are now trying to determine what they do next in terms of the next generation. If they don't feel that they have access to additional workers, they may constrain the size of their operations. And at the end of the day, those operations may not be as profitable. They may not be able to support as many families as necessary in the family farming operation. That may result in the sale of those lands and the reduction of agricultural activity, agricultural land in the country. We lose about 2,000 acres of land every single day already, so that would probably potentially see an acceleration of that. And ultimately over time, if we don't deal with this issue and don't provide stability, ultimately over time we'll continue to see the economic challenges of agriculture continue to mount, and eventually it could compromise the security that we currently enjoy, which is the ability to essentially produce all the food that we need for our own people as well as for exports.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Next, for questions, I recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Vilsack, for your service and for your testimony today. Farm workers in Georgia and across the country make it possible to feed the American people and indeed for the United States to help feed the world. And yet the stories that I've heard from so many farm workers are truly appalling. 20-hour shifts, folks who are sleeping in vans, exposed to extreme heat, exposed to pesticides and chemical fertilizers without adequate protection, making very little money, often paid less than a minimum wage, often subject to other forms of abuse and harassment. Do you believe that these conditions do prevail, as I've heard from so many farm workers in too many places across our country? And what policy reforms must Congress enact in order to ensure that those who are working in the fields to feed our country are treated with the respect and dignity that every human being deserves?
Senator, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act does provide an opportunity for additional support for these farm workers. It obviously provides an opportunity for them for decent housing. It creates the ability to ensure that they have adequate opportunities for protections in the event they get hurt in workers' compensation, things of that nature. It reforms the H-2A system, which provides a series of protections as well so that more folks can benefit from that system and makes it easier for farmers to utilize that system. Nearly 50% of the H-2A workers we have today come from 5 states, one of which is your state of Georgia, as well as the chair's state of California. At the end of the day, it creates a mechanism by which people understand what their rights are able to protect themselves through normal processes. There's a mediation process. There's a shortening, if you will, of the ability to raise concerns about working conditions so that people can get relief sooner. There are a series of steps. Again, this is a compromise bill. And I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that people from all political spectrums have come together in support of this bill because they understand and appreciate how central it is to better working conditions and a stronger and more stable farm economy. And so I would hope that what you've explained are very limited circumstances in agriculture today, and the hope would be with this act that we would see even fewer of those circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Of course, the pandemic has put tremendous strains on agricultural supply chains as well as disrupted labor markets. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, what are some of the most significant challenges that, in your view, Georgia farmers and farmers across the country face in their efforts to hire farm workers?
Well, it starts with the cumbersome process that requires multiple applications, a lot of paperwork, not the use of digital technology to make it simpler and easier. And that discourages or makes it more difficult to get the workforce on a timely basis. So it starts there. And the result of that, I mean, the reality is timing matters. Timing is everything in agriculture. If you don't plant at the right time, if you don't harvest at the right time, it impacts and affects the quality of what you produce, and that in turn impacts the price that you get in the market, and in turn creates challenges for farming operations. So to the extent that we have a stable and secure system that's predictable, it allows farmers and ranchers and producers to plan expansion opportunities, allows them to be as efficient as profitable as possible. It also creates the protections we talked about for workers and ensures that there's an adequate wage, decent housing, and things of that nature for our farm workers who work incredibly hard. And I think it begins to send a message about the significance and importance of this essential workforce from a perspective of respect. I think for far too long we've taken these people and those who work in our processing facilities for granted. We've not paid as much attention to them as we need to. But you know, when it came to protecting our food supply during the midst of the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, those folks showed up. And they showed up at the risk of their own lives, in large part because they were motivated by making sure that they could take care of their families. And that's a value system I would hope that we would continue to support in this country.
Well said, Mr. Secretary, and we should indeed be guided by our commitment to the human rights and human dignity of each individual, and these farm workers deserve far better. And with the chairman's indulgence, my final question for you, Mr. Secretary, grateful for your recent trip to Georgia, your visit in particular to Fort Valley State University, and your continued expressed commitment to Georgia farmers. Will you commit that the next time you come to Georgia, you'll sit down with me, local agricultural leaders, as well as those who are leading Georgia's trade efforts? Of course, we have the Port of Savannah, one of the fastest growing ports in the country, to discuss how we can work together to expand Georgia farmers' access to export markets around the world.
Senator, if you sweeten your offer with a slice of pecan pie, it's a deal.
Done. Looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks for your help. Take care.
Thank you.
Let the record reflect the commitment that has been made here today. I want to thank Secretary Vilsack for joining us. We're grateful for your testimony and insights. We'll now proceed to the second panel. Senator Durbin has returned. I'll return the gavel to him to introduce the witnesses for the second panel. Those of you who are here in person, please come forward at this time.
Special thanks to the Secretary of Agriculture, and I mentioned at the outset, I think it's been 20 years since the Secretary of Agriculture has appeared before the Judiciary Committee. Please don't wait so long to come back. You're always welcome. And thank you for your service to our country. Well, we have a second panel coming up, and I'll tell you who they are. Lene Kustra is a farmer from my home state of Illinois. She and her husband Joel own and operate Kustra Farms, a grain farm in Woodstock. She and Joel were dairy farmers for 40 years, and their dairy herd was one of the highest producing farms in Illinois. Good for you. It received several awards for production and milk quality. Second, we have Arturo Rodriguez. Your almost legendary status, Mr. Rodriguez. You're honored that you're here. President Emeritus of the United Farm Workers of America, or UFW. Spent 45 years with the UFW, the last 25 as our president, continuing to build the union that Cesar Chavez began. We've also been joined by Shay Myers. So I have a confession to make, Mr. Myers. My television appetite starts with the Bears, obviously Chicago Bears, baseball, politics, news, and CBS Sunday Morning, which I hardly ever miss. And I happened to see that show, I think it was 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. And I said to my wife, this fellow named Myers, I would like to have on a panel before the Senate Judiciary Committee because of the powerful presentation that you made. Mr. Myers is a third-generation farmer and the CEO of Oahe Produce, based in Idaho, agribusiness. And Honorable Leon Sequeira is a, did I pronounce your name correctly? Thank you, is a witness who is brought before us by Senator Grassley, and he is not here at the moment, but I'll say this about him. Mr. Sequeira is an attorney with 2 decades of experience in law, politics, and public policy, provides legal and business advice to clients on many matters, including immigration. His clients include several of the nation's largest H-2A employers. And during your career in and out of government, you advised House and Senate offices, cabinet agencies, and the White House. Served as Assistant Secretary of Labor for Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor under President George W. Bush, and you were legal counsel to the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. Oh, okay. And then the other witness suggested on the Republican side, who will be with us virtually, is Miss Jen Sorensen. Grew up on a hog farm in southeast Iowa. Now I see why she was nominated. And went on to receive degrees in animal science and journalism from Iowa State. Ms. Sorensen works as Director of Communications for Iowa Select Farms, a farming business that markets more than 5 million hogs per year. Serves as President of the National Pork Producers Council. She worked for Iowa Select Farms for the last decade. Prior to that, she worked in the communications department of Iowa Pork Producers, Christensen Farm, and McCormick Company. Finally, she manages all activities of the Deb and Jeff Hansen Foundation, founded in 2006 to show gratitude to members of the armed forces and their family, and to deal with issues of food security. Jen and her husband and daughter live in Ankeny, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Iowa. So we're going to start this panel with Lene Kustra. Each of you has, first I need to swear you in. So if you please raise your right hand. All of you, please. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Let the record reflect that they answered in the affirmative. Each of you has 5 minutes, then some questions. Ms. Kustra.
Good morning, or I guess it's maybe good afternoon. Chair Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Linnea Kustra. I'm a farmer in Woodstock, Illinois. My husband, Joel, and I were dairy farmers for over 40 years, and we were both raised on dairy farms. Years ago, labor on farms was all provided by family members. But as dairy farms have increased in size, hired labor has become a critical part of the business. Our dairy herd included 300 cows and 250 young animals. We had 3 full-time employees. About the year 2000, we switched to an immigrant workforce. We had been having a lot of frustration with our labor pool. It was very hard to find employees willing to be at the farm at 4 in the morning to milk cows. Our day started at 4 and finished at 7 p.m., 7 days a week. After switching to an immigrant workforce, our lives became much easier. Our people were loyal, dedicated workers. They were excellent with the cattle, they were hardworking, and they were honest. They were also highly skilled and well-trained. We were extremely proud of our team. Our decision to sell our cows in 2018 was in part because we were worried about losing our workforce. The atmosphere regarding immigrants in the workforce was hostile. We knew we could not run this business without them, and at our age, we decided to sell the cows. This was definitely not an easy decision. I'm here to tell you how essential these workers are to all dairy farmers and critical to our nation's food supply. 51% of the labor on dairy farms is from immigrants. The dairy farms that employ immigrant labor produce 79% of the U.S. milk supply. These are not jobs that are displacing other workers. I ran my dairy farm with my husband for over 40 years, and I can decisively say that the domestic workers just aren't there, even with good pay and good benefits. Our dairy farmer friends are telling us that the situation has gotten worse since we left the industry. They are in crisis mode today, and I say that with a capital C. The farm families and their dedicated employees are working to the point of exhaustion, which has a direct impact on the quality of the work. They are sacrificing a great deal because there are just not enough workers to serve the labor needs on farms. I'm worried about the toll on their physical and mental health. Dairy farmers are resilient. They are creative problem solvers, but they cannot fix this problem. Only you can fix it. This labor shortage will not go away after the COVID recovery. The urgency of the workforce crisis cannot be overstated. Dairy farmers are in a difficult spot because they cannot supplement their workforce with H-2A employees. H-2A visas do not work for dairy farms because they need qualified year-round employees. I'm here to plead with you to help the industry that I love and my friends who are dairy farmers and are up against the wall. One farmer told me he's starting to think about robotic milkers, but he says the cost is astronomical and he does not know how he can pay for it with his 500 cows. If the U.S. dairy industry lost its foreign-born workforce, it would nearly double retail milk prices and cost the U.S. economy, according to a study by Texas A&M University. These are the choices. Do we want our food produced in this country where we have the safest food supply in the world? The labor crisis on our farms is an issue of national security, and it must be addressed now. This will require two critical reforms. First, we must protect our current workers. They deserve the chance to work towards citizenship. They are critical to our nation's food supply, and they are good human beings. Second, we must reform H-2A so dairy farmers have meaningful access to a legal agricultural guest worker program. The bipartisan bill passed by the House of Representatives would make progress toward achieving both of these goals. I just plead with you, please come together on a bipartisan basis, as the House did. Reform our immigration policies so that today and into the future we can continue to feed our nation with a reliable workforce and have a safe, abundant, and dependable food supply. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Kustra. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I sit before you as President Emeritus of the United Farm Workers Union and a representative of the UFW Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. For nearly 2 decades, we have been working tirelessly to achieve farm worker legalization and to reform the H-2A visa program, efforts that would not have been possible without the leadership of Senator Feinstein. The ag industry and our food security rely on approximately 2.4 million farm workers. Roughly half are undocumented and 10% or workers here on H-2A visas. In the United States, represented in this committee alone, there are more than 1 million farm workers. To feed the nation, farm workers work to the limits of their endurance. They work with their dairy cows for milk production, tend livestock for our meat, and plant, tend, and harvest fruits and vegetables. Today, we have with us 5 women that join with me here today, sitting right behind me. Claudia Duran, Lupita Perales from Michigan, Alma Young, Anai, Santiago, and Diana Hernandez from Georgia. Some of them started working in agriculture as young as 5 years old. Collectively, the 5 women behind me and their immediate family members have more than 220 years in agriculture. Their families make it possible for Americans to have food on their tables, and that's why we're here today, because their families have earned a path to legalization. Lack of legal status, the isolated nature of agricultural work, and a shameful history of excluding the industry from basic labor laws makes farm workers vulnerable to a range of abuses. The H-2A program is the visa category linked to the highest number of documented human trafficking cases, cases that occurred in every state represented in this committee, with Georgia, California, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas among the top 5. Farm workers who feed us have earned the right to live and work without fear, to be treated with respect, and to hold their children, spouses, or parents again, to visit loved ones when they are ill, and attend funerals when they depart. To achieve a farm worker legalization, we have made lots of compromises. Together with employers, we have struck 3 major different bipartisan deals. In 2006 and again in 2013, bills to legalize our farm workforce and reform the H-2A program were integrated into broader immigration bills that passed this chamber with overwhelming support. In 2019, during a dramatically different political environment, we spent 7 months in negotiations with ag employers, Democrats, and Republicans. We made serious concessions again in what is now the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, a bill that has passed the House twice now with more than 30 Republicans. Some of these changes have been painful. The bill creates an earned, lengthy, and optional path for farm workers to seek permanent legal status, putting farm workers on a long path to permanent protections, excluding them from access to social safety net programs, and imposing a steep fine for their essential work is not the best way to honor the people who have been breaking their bodies and putting their lives at risk to feed the nation. But we agreed to these compromises. We also agreed to provide employers with a 1-year freeze on wages, an annual cap on wage fluctuations, and access to the H-2A program for year-round employers. These concessions, along with a number of changes to streamline the H-2A program, give H-2A employers the ability to predict cost over the long term and will conservatively provide ag employers with more than $2.8 billion in economic benefits over the next 10 years. It also includes E-Verify. The time is now. We have a House of Representatives that has passed this bill twice, a chair of the Judiciary Committee who is committed to farm worker legalization. We have a president that is ready to sign it. And now we need the Senate to use every tool at its disposal to honor the people that we rely on to feed our nation and bring stability to the ag industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Myers?
I'd like to start by thanking Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley and the rest of the distinguished Judiciary Committee for the opportunity to share my experience and speak on an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. This bill isn't about labor shortages and people skipping ahead of the line. This is about the American dream, the American voter, and the viability of an America that allows the dreamers to dream and the voters to create the change that they dream of. I grew up in a very special place called Nyssa, Oregon. It has a population of just 3,000 people, about 50% white and 50% Latino. Those Latino folks were almost exclusively from Mexico and arrived in our area, at least originally arrived, as migrant field workers. When I was in school and my friend's name was Martha or Mario, out of an unspoken cultural love and respect, we called them Marta or Mario. With two different cultures together, we ate each other's food, tried to speak each other's native language, and most importantly, we worked side by side in fields and on the farms. Admittedly, some of us only did this work for extra spending cash, while others did it out of necessity to help pay rent and keep the lights on. Regardless of the reason, we understood each other better because of it. That's why today, as a friend and as a farmer, I'm here to add my voice to that of Latino farm workers. These farm workers come to the United States from Mexico for the same reason that my great-grandparents came from Germany, and for the same reason that yours might have come from Ireland, Scotland, Poland, Cuba, Holland, Britain, Russia, Japan, or China. They all come to create a better future for themselves, and especially a better future for their children. Let's be honest with ourselves. The last 36 years of policies and political failures have led us here. Now is the time to act. It's not ethical, it's not economically viable, and it's not safe to kick this can down the road yet again. It's not ethical because for the last 2.5 decades, we allowed people to cross our southern border and the system allowed them to be employed in the United States. If you found yourself in a position where you're unable to clothe and feed your family, can you honestly answer that you would not do the same? It's also not ethical for Congress to fail to act again. It's not economically viable because America's farms, ranches, and dairies cannot operate their businesses without sufficient labor. This year on our asparagus farm, we lost 100% of the season's profits because we were unable to get domestic workers when our 36 H-2A workers were delayed at the border for 90 days beyond their date of need. 90 days after we needed them. We lost nearly 300,000 pounds of asparagus. I had to go online and give it all away to any food pantry or family that was willing to come and harvest it. It's not safe because if we can't get workers here, we can't harvest the crops. If we can't harvest the crops, we can't feed you. Sure, we could switch to mechanized low-labor crops like corn, soy, barley, and wheat, but it's not the best use of our nation's water, soil, and other resources. Besides, do we really need 10 million more acres of corn? America needs to grow and produce what's essential to her survival, and fruits and vegetables, not just corn and soy, are basic necessities for a healthy society and economy. When it comes to U.S. vegetable production, let's look at U.S. asparagus production. Acres harvested in the USA have plummeted over 85% since 2004. California now only has 600 acres of asparagus. As recently as 2004, they had 25,000. Asparagus is an extremely difficult crop to harvest. It requires long hours and many hours spent bent over at the waist. Because it is so physically challenging and because labor is so scarce, it was the first crop to leave the United States. Since 1994, over 90% of all asparagus production has left this country. I still grow asparagus, but I can't for much longer if we don't have a workforce and an immigration policy that works, and I'm not alone on this. American voters want fair wages, lower carbon emissions, and the safest food, all grown with as few pesticides as possible. Instead, our vegetable production continues to shift south of the border, where workers earn $8 per day versus a minimum of $150 per day on American farms like mine. In these other countries, there are no enforced emission standards. If you travel south of the border, you'll see smoke and fumes that are allowed to billow from smokestacks and exhaust pipes. And don't get me started on food safety standards or pesticide use restrictions in these other countries. While visiting farms in Mexico and Central America, I have personally witnessed raw sewage being mixed into irrigation water and pesticides not allowed in the United States for decades being sprayed on crops and on workers. This is going to sound like hyperbole, but I believe that if we continue on our current trajectory and without some protections for cheap imports, virtually all vegetable production in the United States will end within a decade. I strongly urge this committee to take action on the Farm Worker Modernization Act, which must include green cards for those that keep America fed and consistent access to labor for farmers through the H-2A visas. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act is one step. Many more are desperately needed in the direction of ethically right, economically smart, and safe policy. Thank you all for your time. I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Mr. Myers. Mr. Scarra?
Thank you. Good. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about the importance of farm workers to our economy and how to best address the shortage of workers on our nation's farms. I've worked on employment and immigration policy for nearly 20 years, including as a staffer in this body, as an Assistant Secretary of Labor, and advising clients in private practice. I represent employers across the country, ranging from small family farms with a few employees to complex family farming operations with thousands of employees. And let me begin by noting that I'm testifying today in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any client. The worker shortage on our farms continues to get worse with each passing year, and it is threatening the future viability of labor-intensive agriculture in America. Farm work is honest, honorable, and necessary work, but there simply are not enough U.S. workers willing to do it. That has been true for decades, and it is true regardless of the unemployment rate. Congress long ago recognized this and created the H-2 visa program in 1952, which was later renamed the H-2A program in 1986. That program today remains the only option for farmers to fill their seasonal labor needs. Throughout its history, the program has been plagued by complicated regulations, bureaucratic inefficiencies, high cost, processing delays, and the exclusion of some agricultural sectors altogether. Despite its numerous shortcomings, farmers simply have no other option. The steadily worsening labor situation has produced dramatic growth in the H-2A program over the last 15 years. In 2005, the Department of Labor certified about 48,000 positions as eligible to be filled by H-2A workers. By 2020, that number was 275,000. But these numbers obscure the fact that farmers are not thriving in the H-2A program. Growth and use of the program has actually slowed in recent years as the constantly spiraling costs put American farmers at a serious disadvantage in the marketplace. Recently, H-2A employers in some states have seen their mandated wage rates increase by 10, 15, and even 23% in a single year, far exceeding general inflation and wage increases in any other part of the economy. And growers face numerous other costs associated with the program, including a requirement to provide free housing. Labor costs for a specialty crop farmer can be 40% or more of their total production cost. As H-2A costs rise, farmers are falling further behind. In recent years, most farms have seen little, if any. There is no margin to absorb rising production costs when you are competing for space on grocery store shelves with imported fruits and vegetables. Americans want cheap food, and bad government policy is pricing U.S. farmers out of the market. 30 years ago, the U.S. was a global net exporter of fruits and vegetables. Today, we import more than twice as much as we export. Nowhere is this disparity more evident than in our trade with Mexico. In the past 15 years, imports from Mexico into the U.S. have tripled. In 2019, we imported more than $15 billion worth of fruits and vegetables from Mexico, while exporting just over $1 billion worth. Much of this is explained by the costs of production in each country. In 2021, the minimum wage in Mexico is about $7 per day. By contrast, the nationwide average wage in the H-2A program is more than $14 per hour, 16 times higher than Mexico. It does not take a PhD in economics to recognize that fruits and vegetables can be grown and harvested in Mexico, shipped to the U.S., and sold in grocery stores for prices far below what it costs a U.S. farmer just to grow the crop. Recent legislation passed by the House, while it may be well-intentioned, does not meaningfully address this problem. Although the House bill proposes a few limited improvements to the H-2A program, it also contains numerous provisions that would actually make the program even more expensive, more bureaucratic, and impose huge new legal liability on farmers. The House bill would also legalize undocumented farm workers. And while there may be reasons to extend legal status to these workers, doing so will not alleviate the labor shortages on American farms. In fact, as we saw in the 1986 legalization, these workers will soon leave the farm in pursuit of other opportunities in the economy, leading to further farm labor shortages. Mr. Chairman, hopefully this committee will have an opportunity to consider legislation that provides farmers with an H-2A program that is responsive to modern agriculture and designed to ensure that American farms can remain competitive in an international marketplace. An updated H-2A program must be simpler, more efficient, less costly, and accessible to all agricultural employers. Thank you again for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Mr. Segura. Ms. Sorensen?
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss an issue of critical importance to U.S. pork producers and all of U.S. livestock agriculture. My name is Jen Sorensen. I'm the Communications Director for Iowa Select Farms in West Des Moines, Iowa, and President of the National Pork Producers Council, a national association representing the interests of more than 60,000 U.S. pork producers. The U.S. pork industry supports more than 500,000 domestic jobs, generates more than $39 billion in gross national product, and exports an increasing volume of product, which in 2020 was valued at more than $7.7 billion. U.S. hog farmers are proud to provide an affordable and nutritious source of protein to consumers at home and around the globe. Unfortunately, the U.S. pork industry is suffering from a serious labor shortage, negatively impacting our farms and our processing plants. As any pork producer will tell you, there is no pork season. It requires a full-time, hardworking, and dedicated workforce on our farms and processing plants. There's an increasing need for employees throughout the entire pork supply chain, but there's been a steady decline in rural population growth where most farms and harvest facilities are located. This has resulted in a labor shortage for U.S. hog farmers and harvest facility operators. Statistics suggest pork industry wages average roughly $14.75 an hour across the country, including many in rural areas where the local minimum wage is much lower. However, despite solid wages and benefits, according to a study by economists at Iowa State University, native-born workers and permanent residents simply cannot offset the need for foreign-born labor. Current visa programs designed for seasonal agriculture, such as the H-2A visa program, fail to meet the workforce needs of U.S. pork producers and other year-round livestock farmers. Now more than ever, we need a dedicated year-round workforce. The U.S. pork industry is proud of our diversity on our farms and across the entire supply chain. For many foreign-born employees, a position in the U.S. pork industry has provided and created opportunity to come to our country and become an integral part of our rural community. We launched a campaign, Year-Round Pork Needs Year-Round Labor, to highlight the vital role of foreign-born workers across our industry. One of our foreign-born employees featured in the campaign, Christina Carmona, is a technical training manager at Prestige Farms in Oklahoma. Christina, who was born in Mexico and grew up raising cattle, came to the United States in 2003 to obtain her master's degree in agribusiness. She is now the lead international recruiter at Prestige Farms, hiring foreign-born employees to help with hog production. She's a stellar employee who is well respected amongst her colleagues, and in 2020 won the Excellence Award from the Oklahoma Pork Council. Working in the U.S. pork industry has created opportunity for Christina and so many others to come to the United States and become integrated in their communities. We are proud of our diversity throughout the pork supply chain and need visa reform to enable the continued production of our year-round industry. Earlier this year, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Farm Worker Modernization Act of 2021, which seeks to address agriculture labor reform by offering a capped number of year-round visas. While NPPC believes this bill is a step in the right direction, a cap will force different sectors of livestock agriculture to compete against one another for the same limited number of year-round visas. In that scenario, no one wins, and ultimately, the consumer will be punished with reduced pork supplies and higher prices at the store. If the labor shortage is not addressed, it could lead to farms and packing plants shutting down. As a result, pork production would be constrained, leading to higher food prices for consumers and the United States becoming an unreliable trading partner for the many countries around the world that rely on our pork. NPPC urges Congress to address this pressing matter by opening the H-2A visa program to year-round labor without a cap. Our industry is vital to the U.S. economy and prosperity in our rural communities. Our foreign-born workforce is an essential part of our supply chain, and we need visa reform to reflect our year-round needs. We look forward to working with members of this committee and other lawmakers to achieve this outcome. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Ms. Sorensen, for your testimony, and thanks to all of you. I'm glad you were here for the earlier part of the hearing when members were asking Secretary Vilsack questions, because I think it puts into political perspective why we have failed for 36 years to pass any immigration reform bills. You think this nation of immigrants would have to modify its laws from time to time to reflect the reality of employment in America and other issues that come before us, and yet we have just been stopped in our tracks, unable to move. And some of the statements made earlier by a few of my colleagues may give you some insight into why that is the case. I happen to disagree with the premise, and the premise seems to be that if we allow one person to receive what they call amnesty and become a citizen of the United States, the message is going to go out around the world. The doors are open in the United States. You can find your way in here. All you have to do is just present yourself at the border. I think there are a million reasons, at least a million reasons, why that argument fails. Because each year we allow 1 million people to become citizens of this country. Naturalization ceremonies are going on today. In fact, one of our staffers has a father who's going through a naturalization ceremony today. So 1 million newcomers to America show up regularly. That's just part of who we are. And yet that doesn't send the message to the whole world that the doors are wide open. Many people have struggled their whole lifetime to be eligible for citizenship. Mr. Rodriguez, you know these workers better than anybody. Tell me what you think about the argument about amnesty and the fact that we're dealing with diseased, terrorist, drug runners who are going to come to this country and make it weaker and worse.
Well, I think the reality is that we have worked very hard with the ag industry as well as with Republicans and Democrats, especially in these last few years, in trying to develop the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, that legislation, to ensure that, in fact, those workers that are working here today in agriculture will continue working in agriculture for years to come. And so as a result, we felt that that is not going to bring, as a result of other folks coming into the country because of the fact that we're doing that. One, they can't even be a part of the program unless in the 2 previous years they worked a certain amount of time in agriculture just to enter into the program itself and to get certified agricultural worker status. So that alone prevents an onslaught of people coming into our country in order to be able to be a part of this program. That won't be allowed. And in addition, for them to attain any other type of legal status in the country, they're going to have to minimally work another 4 years in agriculture, minimally.
Mr. Myers, like some of the other witnesses, you made a great sacrifice to come here today from the Idaho-Oregon border, and I'm really appreciating your presentation, first on CBS and then again today. You just don't seem like the likely witness to be coming before us with your message. An Idaho-Oregon asparagus farmer who is basically telling us we've got to give these people some dignity and some opportunity. Is that a factor of growing up in the community that you described?
Absolutely, it's a factor that I've been privileged to live in. Lots of folks think of homogenous small towns. We have a multicultural and a very diverse group of people that live in my hometown, and that growing up, that appreciation, that love that we have for one another has formed, my opinion of a lot of things. And I will add the personal experiences that I've seen with those trying to work towards DACA or with employees or with schoolmates, and the reality of the immigration system, their circumstances, and what the results were and the consequences of decisions that others made for them.
I was consulting with Senator Grassley because we have an additional roll call that we're facing. And so, Mr. Sakara, do you dispute the the statement that has been made repeatedly that half of the farm workers in this country are undocumented?
I think that's what the best data available shows. The Department of Labor conducts regular surveys of farm workers, in-person surveys, and the result of those show that at least 50% admit to being in the country without legal status.
So if we were to rigidly enforce the laws and they would be deported, then what you predicted, the decline of American fruits and vegetables being grown and exported, would probably be accelerated, wouldn't it?
I think that's fair, yes.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. I might also say that I happen to agree with Mr. Myers that I think consumers are becoming more discerning and asking more questions about what they're buying. And I've got a lot of friends who look very carefully at the origin of fruits and vegetables and lean obviously toward the United States where there are higher standards. Mr. Segarra, do you oppose the notion of a pathway to citizenship for those undocumented farm workers?
Well, personally, I don't have an opinion on that issue. I think the question is, what's the purpose for the legalization? And as I noted in my testimony, I think there are many good reasons that people could put forward to legalize the current undocumented workforce. For me, the question is, what does that do for agriculture and the availability of labor? And while you may legalize certainly workers who are here in illegal status, that doesn't do anything to help the current labor shortage.
Well, let's use the example Secretary Vilsack used. He ran into a farm worker who had been here 20 years working as a farm worker, unable to leave the country because he's undocumented to visit his family in Mexico. So if this became the law, he wouldn't instantly become a citizen and decide to open a franchise restaurant. He has 9 years at least to wait before he becomes naturalized, at least 9 years to wait. And so the suggestion is, at least to me, he's going to continue to be a farm worker for that period of time, but he gets to visit his family. Is that such a bad thing?
Well, again, Senator, that's a question for this body to decide. I look at this issue from the perspective of my clients and the agricultural workforce. And these people are working currently in agriculture, performing very difficult jobs, and certainly many of them without legal status. Providing them legal status certainly would have benefits to those workers and to their employers. But again, that doesn't help larger agricultural problem of labor shortages, and that can only be done through a reform of the visa program. The person that you mentioned, I don't think that's an uncommon story. Many people have come across the border without authorization in the U.S. because of a failure of the visa system. If they had an ability to obtain a visa and travel back and forth across the border, many would. From what my clients tell me, most farm workers aren't interested in becoming U.S. citizens. They want legal status to come here and work because they can earn 16 times more than they can earn at home.
That was a shocking number that I heard from you, Mr. Myers, $150 a day? That's what you pay the farm workers, which basically, if you do the math, that's what it turns out to be, as opposed to $8 a day if they're working in Mexico. That's Senator Grassley.
Yeah. First of all, I want to apologize and thank Senator Durbin for introducing my guest. I was supposed to introduce Leon Segarra and my constituent, Ms. Sorensen, but every Wednesday at noon, I always have a telephone news conference back to Iowa with my journalists in Iowa. So I'm going to start out with Ms. Sorensen. I know that the National Pork Producers Councils and others have long called for agricultural employers with year-round employment needs to have access to the H-2A program. This is an issue that I've heard at many of my county meetings, and I've had 85 of those meetings so far this year. So can you explain some of the challenges your members and similar employers face for not being able to participate in the H-2A program?
Absolutely. I too, as president of the National Pork Producers Council, hear repeatedly from farmers of all shapes and sizes that there are significant labor shortages on our farms because of our rural populations are declining and people are moving to urban centers. We continue to recruit out of high school. We continue to recruit out of college. We continue to place a heavy focus on recruiting from our local labor availability and labor sheds, but there is still a significant gap in staffing on our farms. And there is no pork season. We are 24/7 every single day. We are out there chewing the barns and taking care of our animals. Estimations show that we are 25 to 30% short on our farms throughout the U.S. pork industry and also in our packing plants. The H-2A program, an uncapped year-round H-2A program, is the only type of program that matches the size of the issues our industry currently faces.
You expressed in your opening testimony some concerns you have with the bill before us. Can you explain in a little more detail why you find the bill's cap on the number of H-2A workers that can go to year-round ag employees to be problematic, and how it would impact the employers that you represent?
Well, I think it goes back to the significant volume of employee and worker shortages that we have on our farms. And if we would not want to find ourselves in a situation where we are competing against our fellow livestock farmers for a specific number of workers. And that is why we asked for an uncapped H-2A program and also a year-round H-2A program. We were definitely in support of the Farm Worker Modernization Act. With those two pieces amended, it would be an excellent solution for U.S. pork producers as we look at fulfilling labor on our farms.
Okay, now I'm going to go to Mr. Sequeira. I know your testimony references both the extreme volatility in the H-2A wage rates, along with what, in your view, is a flawed methodology used to calculate this wage rate. For the benefit of the committee, can you explain how the H-2A adverse effect wage rate is calculated and the extent to which it poses challenge for farmers and agricultural employees?
I could, Senator, depending on how much time you have. It's not an easy issue to explain, but in general, the H-2A wage rate is determined based upon a labor survey administered by the Department of Agriculture. Based upon responses they obtain from farmers, they calculate average wage rates over multi-state areas. That wage rate then is used by the Department of Labor wage to be paid in the program. It is extremely volatile, as I noted in my testimony. It can swing virtually always upwards by 10, 15, even 20% or more. Over the last 5 years, I think on average it's been up 20%. But again, depending on where you live in the country, it could be much higher.
This will have to be my last program. Gives you a chance to tell us some changes to the bill, knowing that the act falls short. What are your top 2 or 3 reforms you think Congress should consider making the H-2A program in order to make it more workable for farmers?
In addition to what's already been mentioned, I think undoubtedly the cost structure in the program as proposed in the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is unworkable. In fact, it's worse than the status quo. It would fundamentally change the way wage rates are administered, leading to even higher wages in the future. Beyond that, the bill opens up several entire new avenues for litigation against farmers, includes new private right of actions, allowing workers to sue farmers, authorizes class actions with mandatory fees, mandatory awards. That would be detrimental, certainly to all of agriculture, although it might be somewhat beneficial to lawyers. I don't think it's a good idea and good public policy.
No. I thank you all for participating in this hearing, and particularly thank my colleague or my constituent from Iowa, Ms. Ordens. Thank you. I'll see you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Thank Thank you again to all the witnesses for participating here today. A couple of questions, and unless another member joins us, I may be the last one with questions before we adjourn. Let me start coming back to the urgent topic of COVID. Farm workers were deemed essential during the pandemic, as we've discussed repeatedly here today. But as a result, farm workers continued to work on the front lines of our food supply chains and often had few resources to protect themselves from the COVID-19 virus. Nearly 600,000 farm workers contracted COVID, and the food and agricultural workers in California, I know, have experienced the highest excess mortality during the pandemic, with a 39% increase compared to previous years. For Latinos specifically, the mortality rate reached 59%. According to findings from the National Agricultural Workers Survey, about 1/3 of U.S. farm workers live below the federal poverty level, and fewer than half have health insurance or sufficient paid sick leave. It's not a good combination we're describing here. Many do not qualify for unemployment insurance or other social safety nets because of their undocumented status. These are essential workers. As I mentioned in my earlier statement, I introduced the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act as my first bill to provide a pathway to permanency for farm workers and all essential workers. Mr. Rodriguez, can you discuss how the immigration status of farm workers has impacted them during the pandemic?
Well, it makes it extremely difficult. I mean, here you have a worker that doesn't have legal status in our country, and they feel, first of all, obligated because of the work that they do. That's what they're skilled at. That's what they've been doing. That's what they're knowledgeable about doing. And has been mentioned here today. I mean, that's the way they contribute to our nation in regards to making sure we have a secure food supply. So because the pandemic came, was not a reason for them to leave and discontinue working in agriculture. They continued working. They showed up every day. They made sure that our crops production continued here within this nation, dairy farms working there and so forth. And they'll continue to do so, despite the fact that they did all this at great risk.
Let me just say, their continued commitment and work, contributions to the supply chain, to the economy, despite the risks, despite the dangers, is nothing less than heroic. My next question is for Ms. Sorensen. Now, as a Essential Workers Act, it would cover more than 5 million immigrant workers that have continued to work in a number of sectors, not just agriculture, as essential workers, making sacrifices for all Americans throughout the pandemic. These workers and their households have paid $47.6 billion in federal taxes alone, an additional $25.5 billion in state and local taxes each and every year, significant contributions to our nation's economy. However, they don't have the pathway to permanency and live and work in constant fear of deportation. Now, Ms. Renson, I heard you say earlier that you support permanent status for meat packers. I just want to make sure I heard that clearly again for the record. Meat packers, as you know, are not eligible for H-2A status, which you mentioned causes difficulty for pork producers to hire enough workers to carry out their operations. So if enacted, my bill would put meat packers on that pathway to citizenship. So the question is simple, yes or no. Am I correct in understanding you do support a pathway to citizenship for the workers in your industry?
I'm here to talk about the H-2A program, and I want to focus on the pieces that provide certainty to packers and to farmers. And
well, I know that a pathway to citizenship certainly provides that certainty and fairness for workers in your industry. As time is running out, I do have one more question that I think is critical to mention as we're facing not just drought, but constant extreme heat conditions throughout the West. As temperatures continue to rise across the country, more and more farm workers are at risk of experiencing heat illness, which can cause heat cramps, organ damage, heat exhaustion, stroke, or even death. In fact, between 1992 and 2017, heat stress injuries killed 815 U.S. workers and seriously injured more than 70,000. A recent report published by UCLA found that the financial costs of heat-related injuries in California alone are between $750 million and $1.25 billion each year. The study also found that on days with high temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very common in the Central Valley and other parts of the state, workers have a 6 to 9% higher risk of injuries. That's particularly alarming given the ongoing increasing impacts of climate change. The Asunción Valdivia Heat Illness and Fatality Prevention Act, which I'm a proud co-sponsor of, directs OSHA to implement a heat safety standard nationwide. California adopted its own heat stress standards, and as a result, workplace injuries declined significantly. I was a proud supporter of those state workplace standards in my prior service in state government. Unfortunately, it's not the case for vulnerable workers across the country, and I believe we need a national standard in place. Mr. Rodriguez, can you discuss what recourse immigrant farm workers have if they suffer from heat-related injuries?
Well, certainly in the state of California, we do have laws and legislation. In fact, when that legislation was passed, you drive down Highway 5 now and Highway 99 through the Central Valley, you'll see farmers that have put up coverings, tents, and so forth there for the workers to go when they actually get exposed to the heat, when the temperatures rise to be 90 degrees and up. They're provided with the water and so forth. The unfortunate thing is that that is one of the few states that actually have those protections for farm workers, so that the majority of farm workers still in this country are exposed to heat conditions that have caused, as you said, illnesses that have transpired time and time again, and even deaths. We recently had one in the state of Oregon that prompted state legislation, state regulations to take place there because of the fact that farm workers were dying, is that because of the exposure to heat that they're experiencing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I haven't just seen with my own eyes the statistics of the impact of that state bill, impacting the fields, having toured repeatedly over the years, including this last Friday in and around Fresno. Amazing what a simple concept of a little bit of shade, a little bit of fresh, cool water, and even access to a restroom in the fields can make. It shouldn't take state law to bring about those improvements in working conditions for agricultural workers, but if it does require state law to do it, California proudly has done it, and I believe essential farm workers across the country, regardless of the state that you live and work in, deserve the same protections. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before the committee today and for your participation. On behalf of Senator Durbin, I'm going to begin to conclude this hearing today. But before I do, I want to move to enter a number of statements into the record from a variety of organizations, including the Economic Policy Institute, the Farm Worker Justice, and Immigration Hub. Without objection, these statements will be included. The record will close 1 week from today. Now, in closing, this has been a great conversation, great discussion. As we've referenced so often, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. The House passed this bill that would provide a path to citizenship for undocumented farm workers and their families, meaning that they would be able to continue to do the work that this federal government has deemed essential. They'll continue to be able to do that work, but be able to do so without living in fear of being separated from their families. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act illustrates the kind of reforms our broken immigration system needs to help generate long-term economic growth, establishing a more secure foundation for consumers, for workers, and for employers, while growing our tax base and securing our food supply chain. So now it's our turn to act in the United States Senate. So on behalf of Chairman Durbin and myself, we pledge to do everything in our power, Senator Durbin as chair, myself as a member, chair of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, to move forward legislation to provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented farm workers. Thank you all, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.